She was 13 years old, standing barefoot in a dungeon, scheduled to die at dawn, not for committing a crime, but for loving two little boys who weren't supposed to love her back. They said she was nothing, wolfless, worthless, a stain on the stone floors she was born to scrub. The most powerful Alpha King in 7 territories had looked her in the eyes and called her an insult to the crown. But those two little princes? They called her home. And somewhere in the forest beyond the palace walls, the truth about who she really was had been waiting, patient as winter, sharp as a blade, for 13 years. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this story, you will not want to miss a single second. Drop your city in the comments below and let's see where our pack is watching from tonight. Hit that like button, stay until the very end, because the ending of this one, it will change everything you thought you knew about power, blood, and what it truly means to belong. The screaming had been going on for 9 days. Not just crying, screaming, the raw, relentless, throat-shredding kind that climbed the stone walls of Vale Door Palace and poured out through the arrow slits like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. Servants whispered in the corridors, guards shifted uncomfortably at their posts. Even the enormous warhounds in the courtyard had started howling at odd hours, responding to something primal in the twin princes' wails that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the animal brain. 9 days since Queen Seraphine had vanished, not died, not been taken. Vanished, which, in a court full of shifters whose wolves could track a single drop of blood across 40 miles of open wilderness, was somehow worse than either of those things. It meant she had chosen to go. It meant she had left her newborn sons behind, 2 screaming bundles of royal fury barely 3 weeks old, and walked out of her chambers in the middle of the night without a word to anyone. The official story, the one that King Kalor had issued through his court herald in a voice stripped of every emotion, was that the queen had suffered a break of the mind following childbirth, that she had wandered into the Ashwood and been lost, that search parties were already scouring the territory. Nobody believed him, but nobody said so out loud. Not in Vale Door Palace. The royal nursery occupied the entire eastern tower, 4 floors above the Great Hall, wrapped in the finest silks the kingdom could import and staffed by 12 trained nursemaids who had each spent years caring for noble children. They were experienced women, capable women, women who had quieted colicky infants and teething toddlers and terrified young shifters going through their first early transformations. They could not quiet Ronan and Kale. The twins lay in their matching cradles, carved from white ashwood, inlaid with silver wolves in mid-leap. And they screamed. They screamed when they were fed. They screamed when they were rocked. They screamed when the finest healers in the kingdom pressed their palms to their tiny chests and murmured calming spells. They screamed when their father stood at the threshold of the nursery and stared at them with those cold silver eyes, utterly motionless, as though waiting for them to simply stop on their own. They did not stop on their own. "It's the mother bond," said the head healer, a tall woman named Marette, on the 6th day. She stood before King Kalor in the great hall, her hands folded, her voice carefully neutral. "Their wolves have already begun to form, even at this age. They can sense the absence of her scent. They are grieving. They are infants," the king said. His voice was very quiet. That was always the warning sign with Kalor. Not volume, but quiet. The stillness before the strike. "Infants do not grieve. Alpha children. Find a solution," he said, and walked away. By the 9th day, 3 nursemaids had quit. 1 healer had developed a stress-induced rash across her entire face, and the palace physician had consumed enough valerian tea to sedate a draft horse. The eastern tower had been declared off-limits to most of the court because the constant screaming was affecting the wolves of nearby staff, triggering protective instincts, causing aggression, making 2 of the king's senior advisors physically ill from what one physician cautiously described as empathic resonance overload. The twins were not feeding properly. They were not sleeping. Their tiny faces had gone red and blotchy, their small fists clenched so tightly their knuckles had gone white, and sometimes, in the brief, exhausted silences between screaming fits, they made a sound that was worse than the screaming. a sound like something being slowly torn in half. Everyone in the palace heard it. Everyone in the palace felt it. And deep in the subterranean kitchens beneath the Great Hall, elbow deep in a tub of soapy gray water, a 13-year-old girl heard it too. 1. Her name was Lyra. In the formal ledgers of Vale d'Or Palace, she was listed under the category of lowest domestic staff, unpaired, unranked, which was the palace's careful bureaucratic way of saying wolfless. She had worked in the kitchen since she was 6 years old, brought in as an orphan ward of the court, meaning the crown had some minimal obligation to feed and house her, but absolutely no obligation to treat her with any particular dignity. She scrubbed, she hauled, she peeled and chopped and scoured and carried. She existed in the spaces between the people who mattered, invisible in the way that furniture is invisible, present, functional, and utterly unremarkable. She was small for her age, with tangled dark hair she kept pinned back with a strip of cloth because she couldn't afford pins, and eyes the color of winter bark. Dark brown shot through with amber, eyes that were always watching, always cataloging, always thinking behind whatever blank expression she'd learned to wear as armor. Her hands were perpetually red and cracked from the cold water and harsh soap. She owned 2 dresses, one gray, one darker gray, and a pair of boots that had belonged to someone with considerably larger feet. She had no wolf. In a kingdom of shifters, this was not a small thing. Shifting was not merely physical ability. It was identity, status, connection to the great web of pack bonds that structured every relationship in Vale d'Or society, from the lowest servant to the king himself. To not have a wolf was to exist outside that web entirely. It meant no pack bond, no rank, no instinctive recognition from other wolves, no place in the hierarchies that governed everything from who ate first in the servants' hall to who was assigned which sleeping quarters. It meant you were, in the eyes of everyone around you, less. Lyra had grown up knowing exactly how less she was, calculated and communicated to her daily in 1,000 small ways. The way the other kitchen staff spoke around her rather than to her, the way superior servants would correct her without looking at her, as though issuing instructions to a piece of furniture, the way children of noble staff would sometimes follow her through the corridors, making mock howling sounds, calling her Ghost Girl and the Hollow One, and, most creatively, the King's Dirt. She had learned to let it wash off her like the cold water in her tub. She had learned to find other things to hold on to. It was the head cook, a broad woman named Asta, who first mentioned the nursery situation to Lyra. Not with any particular intention, but because Asta had a habit of narrating her frustrations to whoever happened to be within earshot, and Lyra was almost always within earshot. 9 days, Asta was saying, slamming a cleaver through a joint of venison with unnecessary force. 9 days those poor mites have been screaming, and not one soul in that tower can settle them. Moret's tried every calming draught she knows. Lady Thessaly brought in a bonding witch. Can you imagine? A bonding witch. In this palace, the king would have her head if he knew, and even that did nothing. Lyra said nothing. She scrubbed. "It's the mother absent," Asta continued in a lower voice now, casting a reflexive glance at the kitchen doorway. "The wolves know. Even brand new wolves, barely more than sparks. They know when their mother is gone. And not just gone, but chose to go. That's the cruelty of it." She brought the cleaver down again. Left those babies behind. Left those babies screaming. Lyra's hands had slowed in the water. She was thinking about a sound, not the screaming. She'd heard the screaming, everyone in the palace had heard the screaming, but the other sound, the quiet sound underneath the screaming, in the spaces between. She'd heard it last night through the ventilation shafts that connected the service corridors, lying on her narrow cot in the servants' dormitory and staring at the ceiling and feeling it like a pressure behind her sternum. That sound of something being torn in two. She knew that sound. She had been making that sound somewhere deep and silent inside herself for as long as she could remember. What would settle them, she asked. Asta paused mid-swing, looked at her. This was unusual enough that the cook's expression shifted, briefly, barely, from distracted narration to actual attention. What? The twins. What would actually settle them? Not the calming drafts. You said those don't work. What does work for wolf-bonded infants when their mother is absent? Asta stared at her for a moment, cleaver still raised. Scent bonding, the cook said finally, slowly, as though she wasn't entirely sure why she was answering. Another wolf who can provide a substitute maternal scent. Someone calm, steady, with strong instinctive nurturing response. The wolf would need to want to comfort them. You can't fake it. Pups can tell. She set the cleaver down. Why? Lyra looked back at her tub. No reason. No. She thought about it for 2 more days. She thought about it while scrubbing, while hauling water, while peeling roots in the cold pre-dawn hours when the kitchen was empty, except for her and the banked coals of the fire. She thought about it at night, lying awake, listening to that distant, torn fabric sound traveling through the ventilation shafts with the cold air. She had no wolf. She knew that. Everyone in the palace had made certain she knew that, had repeated it with enough frequency and emphasis that it had become the bedrock truth of her existence, the foundation on which everything else was built. But she also knew something else. Something she had never spoken aloud to anyone, had barely allowed herself to think clearly, because thinking it clearly made it real, and making it real made it something that could be taken away. She had always been able to feel things that other people couldn't, not in a mystical way. She wasn't naive enough to dress it up like that. It was something simpler and stranger, a kind of permeability. Emotions came through her like weather through a gap in a wall. She felt the kitchen staff's exhaustion like a weight on her own shoulders. She felt the aggression of the upper court wolves as a pressure at the base of her skull. She had once spent 3 days feeling inexplicably grief-stricken before discovering that the elderly gardener who worked the herb beds outside the kitchen had lost his wife. No wolf, but something. Something that worked like a wolf, maybe, in ways she couldn't explain and had never tried to. She thought about 2 tiny boys in white ashwood cradles, screaming for something they couldn't name. On the 11th night, she climbed the service stairs to the eastern tower. She almost didn't make it past the first landing. There was a guard on the staircase, one of the king's household wolves, a big man with a soldier's posture and the permanently alert expression of someone trained to assess everything in their immediate vicinity. He saw her coming up the stairs and his whole body went rigid. Halt! Who are you? Kitchen staff. She kept her voice low and steady. I'm bringing... She glanced down at her hands, which were empty. I'm doing a welfare check on the nursery supply stores. We had a moth problem in the lower pantry, and head cook Osta wanted to make sure it hadn't spread to the upper. At this hour? Cook Osta works at this hour. I work when she tells me to work. She met his eyes. Not a challenge, just level, just steady. The twins' feeding stores are in a separate pantry 2 levels up. It will take me 10 minutes. The guard looked at her. His wolf was reading her. She could feel it, that invisible assessment, the animal instinct checking her for threat, checking her for deception. She thought very deliberately about the sounds she'd been hearing through the ventilation shafts. She didn't try to hide them. She let them sit in her chest, visible. His posture shifted. Not much. Barely a degree. 10 minutes, he said, and stepped aside. The nursery antechamber was staffed by 2 exhausted nursemaids who were both so worn down by 11 days of disrupted sleep that they barely reacted when Lyra pushed open the door. One of them looked up, blinked, opened her mouth. I'm not here to cause trouble, Lyra said quietly. I just want to try something. Your kitchen staff. The nursemaid's voice was hoarse. You can't be in here. I know. She kept moving toward the inner door. Are they awake? Are they... The nursemaid gave a short, unhinged laugh. Are they awake? They haven't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch since... The sound hit her the moment she pushed open the inner door. It was worse than she'd expected. Up close, without the dampening effect of stone floors and ventilation shafts, the twins' crying was a physical force, a wave of distress so concentrated it hit her like stepping into cold water. She stopped in the doorway and let it wash through her, all that grief and confusion and wanting, and she stood there and breathed through it and let herself feel all of it and didn't pull away. The cradles were across the room, 2 of them, identical, positioned near the fire for warmth. In each one, a small shape writhed beneath a pale silk blanket. Lyra walked to the nearest cradle. She leaned over. The baby inside, she didn't know which twin, had no way of telling them apart yet, was red-faced and rigid with crying, small fists pressed against his cheeks, eyes screwed shut. He was so small, so impossibly, heartbreakingly small, and so furious with the injustice of whatever he was experiencing. She reached down and put her hand against his chest. He flinched. The crying ratcheted up for one sharp, awful second, and then, like a candle being cupped by a palm, it began to gutter. She didn't know why. She would think about it later, turn it over and over, try to find the explanation in it. All she knew in the moment was that she felt something pass between her hand and his chest. Something like warmth, but not exactly warmth. Something more like recognition. And under her palm, his small heart slowed from its panicked gallop, and his rigid little body began to soften. She started to sing. It wasn't a real song. It was the kind of thing she had made up for herself in the dormitory at night when the loneliness got too heavy. Wordless, low, a melody that went nowhere in particular and made no claims about the world except that it was here and present, and it would not leave. In his cradle, Prince Ronan, and she would later learn this was Ronan, stopped crying. The silence fell over the room like snow. From the other cradle, a snuffle, a small, wet, wondering sound. She crossed to Cale's cradle and leaned over and put her hand against his chest and hummed the same nothing song, and after a moment he too subsided, his breathing slowing into something deep and even, his fists unclenching, his small face going smooth. The nursemaid was standing in the doorway. "Moon and stars," she breathed. "How?" Lyra didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. She stood between the two cradles with her hands resting on two small chests and hummed until she was certain they were truly asleep. And then she stood there a while longer because she couldn't bring herself to take her hands away. She meant to leave. She fully intended to leave. But Ronan woke at the 2-hour mark and started fussing, and she was still there, sitting cross-legged on the floor between the cradles because the chairs had been placed too far from both of them. And she simply reached up and put her hand back on his chest, and he settled again. At 4 in the morning, the nursemaid Petra, the one who had spoken to her, brought her a blanket and a cup of something hot without saying a word about it. Lyra wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and kept humming. When dawn came gray and cold through the nursery windows, both princes were still asleep. Koktek, word spread, because word always spreads. Not immediately, and not widely. There was enough political instability in the palace following the queen's disappearance that most of the court's attention was directed elsewhere, upward, toward the king and his war councils, and the search parties that had been quietly reframed from rescue missions to military reconnaissance. The nursery was a secondary concern to most people above the rank of head servant, but among the servant class, below stairs in the laundry and the kitchen and the stables, the story moved fast. The wolfless girl, the kitchen orphan. She went up there and she just stopped them. Don't know how. Petra says she touched them and started singing some little nothing song, and they just went quiet. First time they'd slept in 11 days. The reaction was not, on the whole, warm. "That's impossible," said Dre, one of the senior kitchen boys, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been asked to prove anything. "Wolfless can't scent bond with wolf pups. Everyone knows that. She probably just got lucky with the timing." Petra said it wasn't luck, said the moment her hand touched, "Petra's been awake for 11 days and she's lost her mind. Don't spread nonsense." Lyra, 3 feet away, scrubbing a pot, said nothing. She was allowed back. Not officially. Nothing was made official, no announcement was made, no change was recorded in the household ledgers. But Petra spoke quietly to the head nursemaid, and the head nursemaid spoke quietly to the palace steward, and the palace steward made a face like someone tasting something unexpected, and said nothing, which in palace hierarchy was effectively permission. She came every evening after her kitchen duties were complete and stayed through the night, sleeping in snatches on the floor between the cradles, and left before the morning shift arrived. She learned quickly which cry meant hunger and which meant discomfort, and which one meant, and this was harder to name, that they had woken in the night and found themselves without her and needed to be reminded she was still there. She learned their faces. Ronan was louder, more expressive, quicker to anger, and quicker to laugh. He grabbed at everything within reach with a fierce proprietary grip, as though cataloging his possessions. He liked to be held facing outward, watching the room with serious dark eyes. He would wake from sleep with a start and immediately look for her, and when he found her face, his expression would go through a rapid transformation: alarm, recognition, relief, satisfaction, that was almost comically transparent for someone who couldn't yet hold his own head up. Cale was quieter. He watched from inside himself. A little. The same inward quality she recognized from her own mirror. That habit of making the face a closed room while something large moved behind the windows. He liked to be held close, face tucked against her neck, and he would fall asleep there with one small fist wrapped in her hair. And she learned to sit very still when he did this, because any attempt to transfer him to his cradle would wake him instantly. He had, she noticed, a tiny crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left ear. She noticed everything about them. She cataloged them the way she'd always cataloged people, quietly, thoroughly, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent a long time being overlooked and has learned to see what overlooked people see. She was 13 years old, and she had never been allowed to belong to anything, and somehow, in the space of 2 weeks, she had become the single most essential person in 2 small lives. She understood this was temporary. She understood it with the part of her brain that had been trained since childhood to preemptively grieve the things she wasn't allowed to have. She let herself have it anyway. Months passed. The official nursery staff adapted around her with the pragmatic flexibility of people who cared more about getting sleep than maintaining ideological positions about wolfless servants. Petra became something close to an ally. Not a friend, Lyra had learned to be careful about that word, but someone who would warn her when inspections were coming, who would save her a plate from the nursery kitchen when she'd missed the servant's meal, who once pressed a small jar of healing salve into her hands without explanation and refused to acknowledge it had happened. The twins grew. They grew fast, the way shifter children do, not just physically, but in personality, in the development of their small, fierce individual selves. At 3 months, they were tracking faces and light with intense focus. At 5 months, Ronan had developed a laugh, like a small thunderclap that startled everyone who first heard it, including himself. At 7 months, Cale pulled himself to standing against the cradle rail and stood there swaying with tremendous concentration for almost a full minute before sitting down abruptly and looking deeply unimpressed by the experience. They laughed almost exclusively in her presence. This was not an exaggeration. It was something the nursery staff noted among themselves quietly, with varying degrees of unease. The twins were not unhappy children. They were fed, cared for, kept warm and stimulated and attended. But the particular quality of ease they had in Lyra's presence, the loose-limbed, unselfconscious abandon of children who feel completely safe, existed nowhere else. With the nursemaids, they were content. With the palace physicians, they were tolerant. With their father, on his rare and stiff visits to the nursery, they were watchful and still in a way that looked too much like wariness. With Lyra, they were themselves. Ronan, at 8 months, had developed a game where he would lunge suddenly sideways out of her arms to see if she would catch him, and then, caught, would give her that thunderclap laugh and do it again. Cale, more methodically, had discovered that if he grabbed her hair with both hands and pulled himself upright against her face, she would make an exaggerated, pained expression that he found inexhaustibly funny. She played along, every time. Even when Ronan's lunging made her heart lurch with genuine fear, and she had to work to keep her face neutral while her arms tightened, even when Cale's grip on her hair was actually quite painful. She played along because they were happy, and their happiness was the most valuable thing she had ever been trusted with, and she would have sustained considerably more pain to protect it. She knew the king visited the nursery. She was always gone before he arrived. She knew things about him, of course. You couldn't spend years in the palace kitchens without absorbing a detailed and nuanced picture of the people above you. Caelor of Vaildor. 32 years old, king since 20, ascended after his father's death in the border wars. He was large, the way powerful alpha wolves are large, every dimension slightly beyond normal proportion, as though the body had been built to contain something bigger than a single person. He was dark, where the twins were dark. She had decided this early on, cataloging their features against what she knew, quietly filing the similarities away. He had a reputation for coldness that was, she suspected from careful observation, slightly inaccurate. Not cold, more contained, glacial in the sense of massive force moving very slowly in a direction it had chosen and would not deviate from. He had loved the queen, once. That much was legible in the palace, if you knew how to read the spaces between things, the way no one spoke her name above stairs, the way certain corridors had been quietly stripped of portraits, the way the king's chief advisor always steered certain topics with the particular care of someone navigating around something broken on the floor. She did not think about the king much. He was above stairs and she was below stairs, and in the ordinary course of events, their worlds would not intersect. She was wrong. But it happened on a Tuesday in the twins' 9th month. She had come to the nursery early. There had been a minor crisis with the kitchen supply delivery that had freed her from her afternoon duties earlier than expected, and she had climbed the service stairs in the gray late autumn light with a slightly better mood than usual, which was rare enough that she noticed it. Petra had let her in with a nod. The nursery was in one of its quieter phases, both princes napping, the afternoon light falling soft and gold through the western windows. She had settled cross-legged on the floor between the cradles, as was her habit, and had been humming and half-dozing when the door opened. Not the service door, the main door. She heard it. The main latch was heavier, different sound, and her head came up, and she had perhaps 2 seconds to register what was happening before King Kalor of Vaildor walked into the nursery and stopped dead. He was in full formal dress, which meant he was coming from or going to something official, which meant there had been no warning because his schedule wasn't shared with the domestic staff. He was flanked by 2 of his household wolves who stopped when he stopped, filling the doorway behind him. He was looking at her. She stood up. Not slowly, not with performance. Just stood. Because sitting on the floor while the king of the realm stood over her seemed like a spectacularly bad tactical decision. In Ronan's cradle, something shifted. A small, drowsy snuffle as the prince sensed the change in the room. Without thinking, Lyra reached back and put her hand on the edge of his cradle, a steadying gesture, almost unconscious. The king's eyes tracked the movement. "Who," he said very quietly, "are you?" It was not quite a question. It had the shape of a question, but the weight of something else. An accounting demand, an inventory check. "Who are you and why are you here and what are you touching?" "Lyra." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Kitchen domestic staff, sir. The nursery staff asked me to assist with the prince's care." Something moved in his expression. "The nursery staff," he repeated. "Yes, sir." "Asked kitchen domestic staff," he said very carefully, "to assist with the care of the crown heirs." "There were difficulties, sir. After the—" She stopped, recalibrated. "The princes were unsettled. I was able to help settle them. The nursery staff felt it was practical to continue." She kept her eyes level. Not defiant. She had the intelligence not to attempt defiance here, but not cast down either. She met his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who has had nothing her entire life, and therefore has nothing to lose. He took a step into the room. His wolves stepped with him. In the cradle beside her, Ronan stirred more definitively, responding to the change in the room's energy, the concentrated alpha dominance that came off the king like heat off a furnace. The small prince's face scrunched. Lyra's hand was still on the cradle rail. She kept it there. "You are wolfless," Kalor said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "A wolfless servant." The temperature in his voice had dropped by some degrees she couldn't measure. "Touching my sons." "I was not—" "You were sitting on the floor of my nursery," he said, and now the quiet was a different kind of quiet, the kind that precedes something sharp. "Between my sons' cradles, with your hand on my heir's bed, and you are going to stand in my presence and tell me this is practical." In his cradle, Ronan began to cry. The reaction was immediate and visceral across the room. One of the household wolves behind the king took an involuntary step forward. The second nursemaid on duty, who had frozen near the windows, made a pained sound and moved toward the cradle. The king's eyes didn't leave Lyra. She reached down, and she did it without thinking, the way she always did it, the same automatic movement she'd been making for 9 months. and picked Ronan up. She felt the king go absolutely still. Ronan's crying sputtered once, twice, then subsided into the small, snuffling post-cry sounds he made when the immediate distress had been managed, but he was still deciding whether to escalate. She put him against her shoulder and he pressed his face there and made a grab for her hair with both hands. She looked at the king over the crown of his son's head. His face was... She had never seen an expression like it. It was the face of a man encountering something that violated his understanding of how the world worked, and the violation was not triggering adjustment, but something more dangerous, something more reflexive. It was the face of a man whose wolf was reading a situation one way while his rational mind was reading it another, and neither was giving him information he wanted. "Put him down," he said. She put him down. Ronan objected briefly, then found her hand and wrapped both of his around two of her fingers, and she let him hold them because she would not, pull away. "Step away from the cradles." She stepped away. Ronan's grip tugged after her, lost, and he made a sound of protest that she felt physically in her sternum. Kaelor crossed to the cradles in 2 long strides and looked down at his sons. Kael had woken in the commotion and was now sitting up in his cradle with the particular wide-eyed focus of someone who has just received important information and is processing it. He looked at his father. He looked at Lyra. He looked at the space between them. He reached toward Lyra. It was a small gesture, just both arms extended, the universal baby gesture. "Come here, I want you." But in the silence of the room, it was enormously loud. Something cracked in the king's expression, just for a second, something that might, in another person, have been pain. Then it closed, and he was the king again. "Get her out," he said. "You are to leave this tower," the palace steward told her that evening, in the stiff, practiced tones of someone delivering a message he was personally uncomfortable with. "You are not to return to the nursery level under any circumstances. Your kitchen duties will be adjusted to ensure no overlap with service routes for the upper tower. The king has made clear that any violation of this directive will be..." He paused, consulted some internal script, "treated as an act of insolence against the crown." He didn't say what the consequence would be. He didn't need to. Lyra stood and listened and kept her face very still. "Do you understand?" the steward asked. "Yes," she said. She went back to the kitchen. She scrubbed pots. She peeled roots. She lay on her cot that night and listened through the ventilation shafts for the sound of crying. It came just before midnight. Ronan first, that immediate alarm cry that meant he'd woken and found the world wrong, and then Kael joining, harmonizing in that terrible 2-part way they had when they were both fully distressed. She lay on her back with her hands flat on her sternum and listened to them cry in the dark, and she made herself breathe through it, in and out, slow and even, and she told herself this was how it had always been and how it would always be, and she had always known this, and knowing it had always been enough. It was not, that night, enough. But she didn't go upstairs. She stayed in her cot. She breathed. She was still breathing when the crying finally stopped, just before dawn. She did not know that it had stopped because a exhausted Petra, at her wit's end, had wrapped one of Lyra's worn gray work aprons around a rolled blanket and placed it in Kael's cradle, and that the twins had pressed their faces into the fabric and gone quiet with the specific relief of something found. She didn't know that Petra had stood over the cradles and wept very quietly for about 2 minutes before collecting herself and getting back to work. She didn't know any of that. She just lay in the dark and breathed. But in the weeks that followed, she worked. She worked with the particular concentrated ferocity of someone who is pouring energy into something because the alternative is standing still long enough to feel what she is trying not to feel. She scrubbed until her hands bled. She volunteered for the worst assignments: the laundry, the ash hauling, the pre-dawn supply runs in the cold. Not because she was trying to prove anything, but because exhausted was easier than awake in her own head. She did not talk about it. There was no one to talk to. Dre, emboldened by the news of her banishment from the tower, had apparently made the story into something of a joke below stairs. Wolfless girl thought she could bond with royal pups. Imagine. And she had to walk past small clusters of quiet laughter twice before she understood what was being said and adjusted her routes accordingly. Petra sent her a message through another nursemaid. Just 4 words on a scrap of cloth. They ask for you. She burned the cloth in the kitchen fire before anyone could see it, and she did not respond, because responding was a kindness to herself that she couldn't afford. She thought about what the king had said. A wolfless servant, touching my sons. She turned the words over, not in a wounded way. The wound was there, but it wasn't what she was examining. She was examining the logic of it, the specific shape of the injustice, trying to understand it the way she had always tried to understand the mechanics of the world she lived in. He had seen her with his sons, and his first response had been, "Not my sons are calm," or "My sons are safe." But this is an insult. She understood why. She had always understood why. The logic of the world she lived in was perfectly consistent once you accepted its premises, and the premise here was that she was less than a wolf, less than a shifter, less than the lowest court member, because she had no wolf, and therefore no rank, and therefore no place, and therefore no right. She understood it. She had always understood it. She just didn't, at the deepest level of herself, believe it. That was the thing she had never let anyone take from her. Not Dre, not the court children with their howling mockery, not the hierarchy that had catalogued her as unpaired, unranked from the age of 6. She understood the logic. She just didn't accept the premise. She was not less. She was just different, and different had been made into less by people who needed it to be less so they didn't have to wonder what it meant. She carried this knowledge like a coal in her chest, small and constant and warm. She scrubbed. She waited. Far above her in the white ashwood cradles, 2 small princes cried in the night and were not soothed. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, in the dark of the ashwood forest and the hidden camps of exiled wolves, something was moving toward Valedor that would change everything. But that knowledge was still weeks away. For now there was only the cold water and the gray dress and the cold warmth in her chest and the patient, bone-deep certainty that this was not, could not, would not be the whole of her story. She scrubbed. She waited. She did not stop believing in herself, even when every voice around her said she should. That was the beginning of everything. 3 weeks after the banishment, the twins stopped eating. Not entirely. They still took milk, reluctantly, in small amounts that left the nursery staff wringing their hands and the palace physician making the tight-lipped expression of someone who knows the answer to a problem and cannot say it aloud. But the robust, enthusiastic feeding that had characterized their first 9 months had given way to something listless and resistant. Ronan would turn his head away from the bottle. Cale would accept it passively, mechanically, with none of the focused engagement he'd shown before, as though eating had become something that happened to him rather than something he did. They were not sick. Every physician in the palace confirmed this. There was nothing physically wrong. They were grieving again, and this time it wasn't their mother they'd lost. Petra sent another message, longer than the first. Lyra read it once, sitting on a crate in the lower pantry where no one would see her, then folded it carefully into quarters and tucked it inside her boot, where it pressed against her ankle all day like a small, insistent pain. The message said, "The physician told Lord Stewart it's attachment disruption. He used a lot of long words, but what he meant was they're pining. Ronan bit a nursemaid yesterday. Not hard, no blood, but still. Cale won't sleep unless someone holds him. I've tried the apron trick twice more, but I think they know it isn't you. I don't know what you want to do with this information. I just thought you should have it." What she wanted to do with it was go upstairs. What she did instead was scrub the floor of the lower pantry until it was clean enough to eat off, then move on to the upper pantry, then the cold room, then the dry stores corridor. She worked until she stopped feeling the press of the folded paper against her ankle, which took approximately 4 hours. It came back eventually. Everything did. The arrangement, when it came, arrived through Petra and an unlikely ally. His name was Oswin, and he was a boy of about 16 who worked in the nursery service corridor carrying linens and hot water and the various practical supplies that the upper-level nursery staff required. He was not particularly remarkable, middling height, quiet manner, a shifter, but low-ranked. One of those people who move through a hierarchical system by becoming as frictionless as possible. He had, apparently, been watching Lyra from some distance for the better part of a year without her noticing, which she found both unnerving and oddly touching when Petra explained it. "He thinks you're—" Petra paused, seemed to weigh her words. "Important," His word, not mine. He says he's watched the twins with every nursemaid and every healer and every person who's been brought in to help since the queen left. And he says what happens with you is different. He says it's not a trick and it's not luck and it's not coincidence. And he says he doesn't care about the king's orders. He should care about the king's orders, Lyra said. Yes, well, he doesn't. Petra pressed her lips together. He has a key to the service corridor on the 3rd level of the East Tower, the one that bypasses the main stair where the guard posts are. It's used for linen deliveries at odd hours, and it doesn't show up on the guard rotation schedule because whoever designed the palace's security apparently never thought about whether linen boys were a threat. Lyra looked at her steadily. I'm not suggesting anything, Petra said. I'm simply telling you that a corridor exists. Petra. I'm simply telling you that a corridor, if I'm caught, Lyra said, it won't be a banishment this time. You know that. Petra met her eyes. She was a woman in her mid-30s, Petra. She had the worn, specific tiredness of someone who has spent years caring for other people's children, a tiredness that didn't diminish the caring but sat alongside it constantly. I know, she said. I'm telling you anyway. There was a long pause. Tell Oswin, Lyra said finally, that I'll need to know the schedule. Guard rotations, shift changes, when the king typically visits, everything he knows. Petra's expression did something complicated. All right, she said. The system they worked out was careful, and it worked. Oswin left the service corridor key on a particular hook in the lower linen room on the days when conditions were right, guard rotation predictable, king's schedule confirmed elsewhere, no surprise inspections flagged. Lyra came up after midnight, moved through the service corridor with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years navigating spaces she wasn't supposed to occupy, and spent 2 to 4 hours in the nursery before leaving well before the morning shift. She always took the key back. She never left any trace she could avoid leaving. The twins, when she came, reacted with a completeness that would have been embarrassing if it hadn't also been, quietly, the most significant thing that had ever happened to her. Ronan would come awake the moment she came through the door, some sense she couldn't name, some awareness that bypassed the waking mind. And she'd find him sitting up in his cradle in the dark, watching the door, waiting. He'd reach for her with both arms and make a sound that was not quite a word yet, but had the unmistakable shape of one. There you are. Where did you go? Don't do that again. Cale's version was quieter and somehow worse to witness. He would simply press his whole face into her neck the moment she picked him up and stay there, very still, like someone checking that a thing they were afraid had disappeared was actually still present. He would do this for 5 full minutes sometimes before he relaxed. She would stand and hold him and let him check, and she would keep her breathing steady and her arms firm and her presence as solid as she could make it. I'm here, she would tell him without words. I didn't go anywhere. I'm here. She always left before dawn. She always went back to the kitchen. She always came back the next time the key was on the hook. For 2 months, they weren't caught. During those 2 months, the political climate in Valedor Palace shifted in ways that Lyra tracked through kitchen gossip and the particular tension that filtered down through the servant hierarchy when something was happening above stairs. The official story about the queen, wandered, lost, search parties ongoing, had begun to unravel at the edges. There were rumors. There were whispers below stairs about messages intercepted, about scouts who had come back with information that had sent the king's senior advisor into the royal chambers with a face like a closed fist and hadn't come out for 3 hours. Seraphine was not lost. Seraphine had not wandered. The rumors below stairs, pieced together from fragments Lyra collected over weeks, told a different story. The queen had gone somewhere. The queen had gone to someone, and somewhere beyond the Ashwood, in the territories that bordered Valedor to the west and north, something was being assembled, salt, quietly, carefully, with the deliberate patience of someone who had been planning for a long time and was not yet ready to move. Lyra filed this away. She had no context for it, no access to the actual information, no way to assess its accuracy. But she filed it away because she had always paid attention, and paying attention was the only power she'd ever had. Below stairs, the mood in the kitchen sharpened. People snapped, Small arguments that would normally blow over quickly turned hard-edged and lasting. The head cook, Asta, had started appearing in the kitchen earlier than usual with dark circles under her eyes, and she'd taken to standing at the kitchen door that opened onto the lower courtyard and staring northward for minutes at a time, which she would never have explained if asked. War was the word nobody was saying. War was the shape of everything. It was Oswin who told her in late autumn about the council meeting. He'd delivered it in person this time, which was unusual. He typically left everything through Petra, maintaining a careful distance that protected them both. His appearing directly in the lower kitchen was enough of an anomaly that she stopped working and gave him her full attention. He was agitated. He was doing a good job of not showing it, but she could read agitation in the held-still quality of his posture, the way people go more controlled when something inside them is the opposite. "There was a council meeting this morning," he said, quietly, moving to stand beside her at the washing tub so they both had plausible reason to be in the same place. "I deliver linens to the council antechamber. Sometimes—" he paused briefly. "Sometimes the doors aren't as closed as people think they are." "What did you hear?" "They've confirmed she's alive, the Queen." He said it flatly, like delivering a verdict. "She's in the Western Territories, in the border region past the Ashwood. She's been there since she left, and she's—" Another pause. "She's been building something, an alliance. Border packs, exile wolves, some of the smaller territories who've had grievances with Vildor." Lyra's hands had stilled in the water. Building an alliance for what? Oswin looked at her with the careful expression of someone about to say something significant. "The prince's," he said. "She wants her sons back." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "The king's response?" Lyra asked. "Fortify the borders, increase palace guard rotations, and—" Oswin's voice dropped further. "He's accelerating the twins' relocation to the inner keep, the high-security residence, away from the East Tower, away from the service corridor, away from the key on the hook, away from Lyra." She turned back to the washing tub and didn't say anything for a while. Oswin stood beside her in the quiet. "When?" she asked finally. "The end of the month. Maybe sooner if the border situation escalates." She nodded, once. "Thank you." He left. She scrubbed. She had perhaps 3 weeks. She used them. She didn't change anything visible. No increase in the frequency of her visits. No alteration in the patterns they'd established. Nothing that would register as escalation to anyone watching. But something changed in the quality of her presence in the nursery during those 3 weeks. Something that the twins seemed to read with their particular accuracy. She talked to them more. She had always hummed, always held, always been there in the night's quiet. But talking was different. Talking was something she'd held back because talking felt like claiming, and claiming felt like something that could be punished. She held that back now because there were only 3 weeks, and there were things she needed to say. "Your name is Ronan," she told him one night, sitting cross-legged with him in her lap while he investigated the fraying edge of her blanket with profound seriousness. "You're going to be enormous and terrifying when you grow up, which is going to be hilarious because right now you're about the size of a large loaf of bread. You have your father's frown. I've only seen it twice, but it's unmistakable. You already know what you want, and you already know how to make people understand that you want it, which is going to serve you very well unless you end up using it exclusively to get someone to play the throwing game at 2 in the morning." Ronan, without looking up from the blanket fringe, made a decisive sound. "Right," she said. "The throwing game it is." She talked to Cale differently. He was awake, watching her face in the low firelight with those grave inward eyes, and she told him, "You think a lot. I can tell. You're always watching, always cataloging. You feel things bigger than you show, and someday someone is going to misread that as coldness, and they'll be wrong. The things happening behind those eyes of yours. I can see them, even when nobody else can. That is not nothing. That is everything." Cale put both hands on her face and regarded her with the expression of someone who has understood something important. She closed her eyes for a moment. She did not say, "I don't know if I'll see you again after this month." She did not say, "The world is going to separate us because of rules I can't change." She did not say, "I love you both, and I have loved you both since the night I put my hand on a screaming infant's chest and felt something pass between us that I couldn't name then and can't name now. She didn't say any of that. She put it somewhere else, somewhere deep and sealed, where it could stay. Sleep, she told them. I'm here. They slept. The crisis came early, not at the end of the month, not with the quiet, scheduled inevitability of the king's relocation plan. It came on a night 2 weeks before, without warning, and it came from outside the palace walls. She heard it first through the ventilation shafts, not the twins crying, but something else. A low, reverberating alarm. The war horn, the deep bronze one that lived in the watchtower and was only ever sounded when the threat was at the border. She lay in the dark and counted the blasts. 3 long, 2 short. Perimeter breach. Not an attack, not yet. An incursion. Scouts or advance force. The Queen's army was moving. She didn't know this with certainty. She was a kitchen servant lying in a dormitory cot with no access to military intelligence, and she knew better than to mistake her own interpretation for fact. But she had been listening carefully for months, and the listening arranged itself into a shape. The alliance Seraphine had been building was large enough now that it was moving, and it was moving faster than the king had anticipated, and somewhere in the palace above her, in the cold stone corridors of Vielle d'Or, every person with a rank and a wolf was mobilizing. She lay in the dark. She thought about Ronan's face when he woke in the night and found the room wrong. She thought about Cale's hands checking her face to be sure she was still there. She thought about a palace on a war footing, full of frightened and aggressive wolves, and 2 10-month-old infants in a tower that was no longer, in any meaningful sense, safe. She got up. The kitchen was chaos when she came through it, staff moving quickly, someone shouting orders about emergency provisions. The kind of organized panic that looked like disorder from outside, but had a direction and a purpose if you understood it. Nobody looked at her. In a crisis, the lowest members of the hierarchy become even more invisible, which she had always understood and now used with focused deliberateness. She took a cloak from the peg by the service entrance. Not hers. She had no good cloak. This one belonged to one of the laundry women and was 3 sizes too large. And she kept moving. The service corridor key was not on the hook. She stood in the lower linen room and looked at the empty hook and breathed through the spike of cold that hit her sternum. Right, Oswin. Oswin was from the servants' hall, which meant he was either sheltering in place under the emergency protocol or he'd been mobilized as a runner, and either way the key wasn't here and she had exactly no time to spend on alternatives. She knew the main stair. She knew the guard rotation. She'd memorized it months ago through Oswin's careful reporting. Under normal circumstances, 2 guards on the second landing and 1 at the nursery floor door. Under emergency protocol. She didn't know the emergency protocol. She went up the main stair anyway. The second landing was empty. Both guards had been pulled, presumably to the outer walls, the gates, wherever the war footing required them. She felt this as the specific, disorienting relief of a danger that wasn't danger, the sensation of bracing for something that didn't come. And she didn't let herself stop to process it. She kept moving. The nursery floor door was unlatched. She pushed through. The antechamber was also empty. No nursemaids, no Petra, nobody. Through the inner door she could hear the twins, not screaming yet, but making the precursor sounds, the escalating fuss that preceded full alarm, and underneath those sounds the specific vibration that she associated with their wolves responding to environmental threat. The palace's tension was coming through the walls to them. Infant wolves reading the emotional state of every adult around them, reading danger, danger, something is very wrong, and beginning to unravel. She went through the inner door. Both boys were in their cradles, awake. Cale was standing upright, gripping the cradle rail with both hands, staring at the door with a face that shifted from alarm to... She watched it happen. Something that was the infant version of profound whole-body relief. He reached for her immediately, a full-arm lunge that nearly toppled him. "I've got you," she said. I've got you, easy." She had Cale on her hip and was moving toward Ronan when she heard the main door behind her open. She turned. King Calor stood in the doorway. He was not in formal dress this time. He was in battle gear, The dark leather and iron-gray wolf fur of a king who has just come from his war council and is going back to it, with at his hip the long-bladed sword she'd heard stories about below stairs, and had never expected to see this close. He had clearly come to check on his sons himself, in whatever brief window the emergency had opened in his schedule, and he had found, instead of an empty room or a trusted nursemaid, the wolfless kitchen servant he had banished 6 weeks ago. The silence between them was very short, maybe 3 seconds. "You," he said. She held Kale on her hip and kept her feet planted and didn't move. Behind her, Ronan was quiet now. She had crossed far enough into the room that he could smell her, hear her breathing, and his fussing had subsided. "The nursery staff wasn't here," she said. "The twins?" "You," he said again, and this time it wasn't an identification, it was an indictment. His voice had gone to that quiet that she had learned to read as the storm before impact. "I gave you a direct order. You are not to be in this tower. You are not to be near my sons." "I know." "Then what?" he said, moving into the room, every word controlled and precise and dangerous. "Are you doing standing in my nursery holding my air?" "Kale was going to fall," she said. "He was standing up in the cradle and he—" "Put him down. He'll put him down." She looked at the king. She looked at the sword at his hip. She thought about the war horn she'd heard through the ventilation shafts, about the queen's army moving, about 2 small boys who needed tonight, specifically tonight, to not spend alone in the dark while the palace shook around them. She did not put Kale down. It was the moment. She understood it as she stood there, understood it with the clarity of someone who has spent their life doing the correct calculation for self-preservation and is now, deliberately, choosing differently. This was the line. On one side of it was the life she'd always had, the one where she did what was required and survived and stayed small and kept the coal warmth burning in her chest so she didn't forget what she knew about herself. On the other side, she didn't know what was on the other side. She'd never been there. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was steady. It surprised her, the steadiness. "Your sons have been in distress since the alarm sounded. Their wolves are responding to the tension in the palace. The nursery staff isn't here. They need proper caretakers, and a wolfless servant is not. There are no other caretakers here right now." She kept her voice level, not defiant, not performing bravery, which she didn't feel. She felt sick with fear and calm at the same time, which was a paradox she didn't have time to examine. "I am here. They have calmed down because I am here. If you remove me, they will not calm down again tonight, and tonight of all nights, with everything that is happening beyond those walls. They need to sleep, sir. They need to feel safe. And the only thing that is going to do that—" She looked at him directly, across the space between them, with Kyle's face pressed into her shoulder, "is me. I don't know why. I have never known why. But it is true. And you know it is true. Because you have seen it happen. And the only reason you will not say so is because saying so requires you to acknowledge that a wolfless servant did something that none of your healers and none of your nursemaids and not even you yourself have been able to do since your wife left." The silence that followed was the longest she'd ever experienced. Kaelor stood in the center of the nursery and looked at her with an expression she could not read, and a stillness that was beyond his usual containment, the stillness of something that has been fundamentally challenged and is deciding, with great care, what to do about it. Ronan, from his cradle, made a sound, not a cry, more of a query. "What's happening? Is everything all right? Why is the room different?" Without looking away from the king, Lyra reached back and put her free hand on the edge of Ronan's cradle. The same gesture she'd made the first time in this same room. The automatic, unconscious gesture of someone for whom this had become second nature. Ronan quieted. Something shifted in the king's expression. Just barely, just for a second. "You overstep," he said. His voice had changed, still low, still controlled, but something had gone out of the edge of it. Something that had been steel had become, fractionally, something else. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry for the overstepping. I'm not sorry for being here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. his back to her. "Stay until Petra returns," he said. "Then you leave, and you do not return. And if I find you in this tower again—" He paused. "I will not be generous a second time." He walked out. She stood very still in the silence he left behind, holding Kale with her hand on Ronan's cradle, and she waited until she was quite sure the door was fully closed before she let herself breathe properly. It was not a victory. She was not naive enough to call it that. It was a stay, a single night's reprieve with a threat woven through it that she couldn't afford to ignore. But he had looked at her putting her hand on Ronan's cradle, and he had said, "Stay." She turned back to the twins. Petra arrived just before 3 in the morning, breathless and disheveled, with the expression of someone who had been doing 3 things simultaneously for 6 hours straight. "You're here," she said, and then, reading Lyra's face, "He found you. He gave me until you arrived." Lyra transferred a sleeping Kyle to Petra's arms. "Be careful. He's in the deep sleep. You'll want to support." "I know how to hold a baby," Petra said, but not unkindly. She settled Kale against her chest and looked at Lyra over his dark head with an expression that was complicated and careful. "What did he say?" "That the next time won't be generous." Lyra tucked the blanket around Ronan, who had fallen back into sleep in the last hour. "He meant it. He usually does." Petra was quiet for a moment. "The situation outside is bad. The Queen's forces, it's not a probe, it's the beginning of something real. The king is going to have the twins relocated to the inner keep this week. Not the end of the month. This week." Lyra smoothed the blanket once more over Ronan's small shoulders. "I know," she said. "Lyra!" Petra's voice had dropped. "What are you going to do?" She stood up straight, looked at the 2 sleeping princes, looked at Petra. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. She picked up her borrowed cloak. She moved to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, the same position the king had stood in an hour before, and she looked back at them, at the white ashwood cradles, at the 2 small faces soft in sleep, at the faint silver light of pre-dawn beginning to gray the windows. "Tell Oswin thank you," she said, "for everything." She went down the stairs and back into the dark. 3 days later, Vialdor shook. Not metaphorically. The palace literally shook. A low, resonant vibration that traveled up through the stone floors at dawn on a Wednesday and knocked cups off the kitchen shelves and sent a crack running 4 feet along the mortar of the eastern wall. Below stairs, people grabbed tables and door frames and each other and went very quiet for the 5 seconds it lasted. It was not an earthquake. "Siege engine," said one of the older kitchen men when it was over, in the tone of someone who has heard that sound before. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. Above stairs, Lyra could hear the distant, clarifying sound of the war horns. Multiple now, a pattern she didn't know the meaning of, but whose urgency was unmistakable. Running feet in the corridors overhead, shouted orders muffled by stone, and from the east tower, high above, filtered through floors and walls and the complex acoustics of the palace's interior, screaming. Not siege engine screaming, not the screaming of soldiers or servants caught in the initial shock. 2 separate, distinctive voices, already known to her at a molecular level, screaming in the specific register that meant terrified, don't know what's happening, need you right now. Lyra stood in the kitchen with a pot in her hands and listened to the twins scream. She set the pot down on the counter very carefully with both hands, the way you set something down when you want to make sure it doesn't tip. She took off her apron, she folded it and placed it next to the pot, and smoothed it with her palms. She picked up the borrowed cloak from the peg by the service door. Dre, watching from across the kitchen, said, "Don't. You heard what the king said. He'll put you in the cells." She tied the cloak at her throat. "Lyra." Dre's voice had changed, the mockery gone, replaced by something more uncomfortable and genuine. "You're wolfless. You can't do anything. You can't protect them from a siege." She looked at him for a moment. He was not wrong. She had no wolf. She had no rank, no weapon, no power in any of the forms that Vialdor Palace recognized as power. She could not stand between 2 royal infants and a queen's army. She could not fight. She could sit on the floor between 2 cradles and hold 2 screaming children and be the thing that made the world make sense again when everything outside was noise and terror. "I know," she told Dre. She walked out the kitchen door. She went up the stairs. Behind her, in the kitchen, Dre stood very still for a moment. Then he went back to work, because that was the only thing left to do, and because he had a feeling, one he would not have admitted to anyone, that something that could not be undone was happening in the palace above him, and he was watching its beginning from the wrong floor. She was almost at the second landing when she heard the voice. Not the king's voice, a woman's voice, coming from somewhere close above her, through the wall, speaking with a cold authority that had the specific quality of a person accustomed to being obeyed. Secure the tower exits first. The princes are the priority. Do not let the current staff clear the premises until I have verified. Lyra stopped on the stair. The voice did not belong to anyone she recognized. It did not belong to any senior nursemaid or palace staff member. It had an accent she had never heard in Vael Dor, something in the vowels that was borderland, western, a sound from beyond the ashwood. She stood very still on the stair and understood, with a sudden cold lucidity, what was happening. The palace hadn't been breached, not in the way the warhorn pattern suggested. The siege engine strike had not been an assault. It had been a distraction. And while every wolf in the palace had their attention on the outer walls and the distant tree line, the queen was already inside, and Lyra was standing on the main staircase of the East Tower with no wolf, no rank, and no plan, halfway between a king who had threatened to imprison her and a queen whose forces had just infiltrated his palace to take back her sons. She had approximately 10 seconds to make a decision. She went up. The nursery door was open. She could see it from the top of the stair. The main door, which should have been guarded, hanging ajar, the light from inside falling across the corridor floor in a pale rectangle. She could hear voices inside, Petra's, strained and high, another voice she didn't recognize, and underneath both, the twins crying, which had not stopped, which was getting worse, which had taken on the specific, desperate quality that meant they'd been frightened for too long and were starting to tip from fear into something that would take a long time to come back from. She pushed through the door. There were 3 people in the nursery who hadn't been there before. 2 of them were soldiers, border wolves in the Western Pack's colors, armed, flanking the doorway with drawn blades. The third was a woman standing between the cradles, with the twins crying washing over her like weather she was waiting to pass. She was beautiful, the way certain things are beautiful and also terrifying, high cheekboned, pale-eyed, with the coiled containment of a predator at rest. She was not touching the twins. She was standing between their cradles with her hands loose at her sides and looking at them with an expression that Lyra could not read from the door. Something between reaching and afraid, something enormous held very tightly in check. Neither twin had quieted. One of the border wolves moved toward Lyra the moment she appeared. His blade came up. "Stop. Let her through," said the woman between the cradles without turning. The wolf hesitated. "My lady, she's palace staff. I can see what she is." The woman turned. She looked at Lyra across the room, across the crying and the blade and the distance between them, with those pale eyes that seemed to be reading something that Lyra couldn't see written on herself. Something the woman had been looking for. Something she'd recognized. "Let her through." He stepped aside. Lyra walked to the cradles. She picked up Ronan first. He came to her with the force of something falling, pressing his face against her neck, his small fists clenching in her hair, the crying stuttering and slowing and beginning to resolve. She shifted him to her hip and reached down for Kyle with her free arm, and Kale came the same way, the same recognition, the same terrible, complete relief of something found. The crying stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. The woman between the cradles was watching her with an expression that Lyra could not name, had no reference for something vast and careful and entirely contained. Her pale eyes moved between Lyra's face and the twins' faces, and the way the twins had pressed themselves into her with the absolute trust of children who have found the only safe thing in the room. "How long?" the woman asked. Her voice was very quiet. Lyra met her eyes. "Since they were 11 days old." The woman said nothing for a moment. "What is your name?" she asked. Lyra told her. The woman went completely still. She went still in the way that Lyra had sometimes gone still. Not the king's glacial stillness, not a controlled thing, but the stillness of someone who has just heard a word that shouldn't exist, a word that rewrites everything in the room around it. Lyra, she repeated, and her voice had changed on the word, changed in a way that Lyra did not understand yet, that she did not have the context to understand, that would take weeks and wilderness and survival and a truth she couldn't have imagined to make sense of. Yes, Lyra said. And behind them, from the corridor outside, they heard the thunder of boots on stone, and the king's voice, cold with fury, calling orders that had her name in them. The boots hit the corridor floor like a drumbeat counting down. Lyra stood between the cradles with both princes pressed against her chest, and she did not run because there was nowhere to run. The nursery had one main door, two narrow windows 15 feet above a stone courtyard, and the border wolves flanking the entrance who were already turning toward the sound of approaching soldiers with hands tightening on their blades. The woman, the queen, she understood now, she had understood from the moment she'd walked through the door, had simply not allowed herself to name it, moved fast. She crossed to the window in 3 strides and looked down, assessing, then turned back with the expression of someone whose plan had just acquired a complication. "How many guards does he have on the east corridor?" she asked Lyra directly, as though Lyra were a resource she had already decided to use. "I don't know the emergency rotation. Estimate. 4, minimum. 6. If he pulled from the outer wall posts when the alarm..." The door came open. Not slowly, not with the weight of deliberate authority, the way it had opened when the king came to check on his sons. It came open the way a wound opens, sudden, total, with force behind it that had been contained and was no longer. Kalor filled the doorway. He was still in his battle gear, sword drawn now. She'd heard the stories about that sword for years and had tried to prepare herself, but the actual sight of it was different from stories, longer and darker, with an edge that caught the low firelight and made something in her animal brain go very quiet and very alert. Behind him were 4 soldiers, 2 already fanning into the room, and behind them she could hear more in the corridor. His eyes moved across the room in a single sweep. The border wolves, the woman by the window, and Lyra in the center with his sons on her hips. The sweep stopped. "Seraphine," he said. His voice was nothing. It was the voice of a man who has spent months preparing for a confrontation and is now discovering that preparation bears almost no relationship to the actual moment. The queen stood by the window and looked at her husband with the pale-eyed steadiness of someone who has also been preparing, and for longer. "Kalor," she said. The room was so still that Lyra could hear the twins breathing. "You walked into my palace," he said. "I walked into my children's nursery." She didn't move. "Which, I should point out, has been somewhat poorly managed in my absence." Something moved in his expression, a crack in the control, quickly sealed. "You left." "I escaped." The correction was precise and flat. "There's a difference, and you know there is. And we are not going to debate semantics while I am standing 15 feet from my sons for the first time in almost a year. You don't get to cut..." "Kalor." She took a step toward him, and something in the room shifted. The temperature, the pressure, the specific weight of a moment that has been building for months arriving at its point. "I want my children. I built an army to come and take them if I had to. But I came here first, tonight, because I wanted to ask you before it came to that. I am asking you. Give me my sons." "Your sons," he said, "are royal heirs of Vaildor. They stay in Vaildor. They are also my children, flesh of my flesh, and they have been without their mother for 10 months, which..." Her eyes moved briefly to Lyra, and in that brief movement was something complicated and specific. "Appears to have had consequences that even you cannot ignore." Kalor's gaze followed hers to Lyra. Lyra held still. She was very aware in that moment of the exact weight of each boy on her hips, of Kale's fist in her hair and Ronan's face pressed against her shoulder. She was very aware that she was standing in the middle of a confrontation between a king with a drawn sword and an army outside the walls, and a queen with border wolves at her back, and that she was the least powerful person in this room by every metric Vaildor recognized. She was also very aware that both twins were calm, and that every other person in the room was not. "The girl," Kaylor said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not the threatening quiet, not the controlled fury, but something rawer and more confused. Is a kitchen servant. She has no wolf. She has no rank. She has been in this nursery in direct violation of my explicit— I know what she is, Seraphine said softly. Something in her tone made the room shift again. Not the temperature this time. Something else. Something that went sideways in a way Lyra couldn't track. Kaylor heard it too. She watched him hear it, watched some new alertness enter his posture, something beyond the tactical. What does that mean? He said. Seraphine looked at him. Then she looked at Lyra. Then she looked at the twins, pressed into Lyra's chest, sleeping now against all probability, the way they always slept in Lyra's arms in the middle of a room full of tension and danger and things too large for small children to survive being awake for. It means, the Queen said carefully, that we need to have a conversation that is 10 months overdue. We don't have a conversation, Seraphine said, her voice going harder, about why your sons trust this girl more than they trust either of their parents, and why she can do something with them that no wolf in this palace could do, and why— She paused, and the pause was the most deliberate thing in the room, more deliberate than the drawn sword, more deliberate than the border wolves' hands on their blades. She has the same eyes as my mother. Silence. Kaylor went very still. Lyra turned to look at the Queen. What did you say? She asked. Her voice came out steady. She was always surprised, at the worst moments, by her own steadiness. Seraphine looked at her with those pale eyes, and there was something in them now that had not been there before. Something enormous and careful and terrifying. I said, the Queen repeated slowly, that you have the same eyes as my mother, who died 14 years ago, when she was still carrying her first grandchild. The room did not move. No one in it moved. I don't understand, Lyra said. No, Seraphine said. You wouldn't. You were 6 days old when I last saw you. The silence lasted longer than any silence Lyra had ever been in. It lasted through a border wolf shifting his weight and the faint sound of the siege horn at half volume on the outer wall and a coal settling in the nursery fire. It lasted through Kale making a small, sleeping sound against her shoulder, and Ronan's grip on her tightening in some subconscious response to the change in the room's weight. It lasted until Kaylor said flatly, That is not possible. I know it isn't what you want to hear. Seraphine's voice had changed. The political edge was still there. The calculation, but underneath it something that sounded like exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a truth for a very long time. But possible and true are different things, as you and I both know very well. You had one child. You lost it. The physicians told you what I asked them to tell you. Her voice was very quiet. She was born without a wolf, Kaylor, in my court, in your kingdom. I knew what that would mean for her. I knew what you would say. I knew what the pack would say, what the hierarchy would demand. A wolfless heir is no heir at all. She would have been stripped of rank before she could walk. She would have grown up in this palace as something less than the lowest servant, and she would have spent her entire life being reminded of it by every single person in it, and I could not— She stopped. Her jaw tightened. I could not let that happen to my daughter. Lyra's arms had tightened around the twins without her deciding to. She was doing the calculation. She could feel it happening behind her sternum, the parts of her that had always been good at sorting information clicking through it with a terrible mechanical efficiency. The orphan ward of the court, brought in at 6 years old, no record of parents, no explanation offered. The specific way she had always been able to feel what wolf-bonded people felt. The thing that happened when she touched the twins, that warmth, that recognition, that passing of something through her hands that she had never been able to name. She thought about Kale's small fist in her hair. She thought about Ronan's habit of turning to find her face the moment he woke. She thought about the cold warmth she'd carried in her chest for as long as she could remember, the deep, unshakable knowledge that she was not less, that the premise was wrong, that she had something the world couldn't see and therefore couldn't take. She thought about being 6 days old, being carried out of a palace, being left somewhere. She wasn't lost, Kaylor said, and his voice had gone from flat to something else entirely. You told me she was lost. Yes, you lied to me. I protected her. Seraphine met his eyes without flinching. And then I protected myself when protecting myself became necessary. Which you know it became, Kaylor. You know why I left. Don't stand in front of me with a sword and pretend you don't know why. A long, terrible pause. She's been in my kitchen, he said. He said it like a man trying to make arithmetic work. For 7 years, she's been washing dishes in my kitchen while she was safe, Seraphine said, which is what I intended. She was alive. She was anonymous. She was no one anyone would hurt because no one would look twice at a wolfless kitchen girl. The Queen's voice broke on the last word, very slightly, very briefly, and then sealed itself back up. I checked, when I could. I had people who could tell me she was alive and unharmed. I told myself it was enough. Was it? Lyra asked. Both monarchs turned to look at her. She was surprised to find that she was angry. She hadn't expected anger, had expected the blankness that usually covered her feelings in situations too large to process, had expected the professional numbness she'd cultivated since childhood. Instead, there was something bright and hot in her chest that was not the coal warmth, was something less patient than the coal warmth, was something that her body had apparently decided this particular moment warranted after 13 years of quiet. Was it enough? She repeated. I would like to know. Because from where I was standing, from the floor of a kitchen where I scrubbed pots from the age of 6, where people called me Ghost Girl and Hollow One and told me I was nothing because I had no wolf, from where I was standing, it did not feel like enough. Seraphine looked at her. The Queen's face did something that Lyra had no vocabulary for, something that moved through several things rapidly, none of them simple, all of them enormous. It was not a comfortable expression to watch. It was the expression of someone confronting the actual weight of a choice they made 13 years ago, in full, without the distance that time usually provides. No, the Queen said. Her voice was very low. It wasn't. The admission fell into the room like a stone into deep water. Kaylor made a sound that was not quite a word. And from the corridor outside they heard a new sound. Running feet, yes, but also something else, something deeper and more resonant. The kind of sound that a large body of armed wolves makes when it is moving through a stone corridor with purpose. The Queen's forces hadn't waited outside. Some part of her advance team had gotten deeper into the palace than the outer walls, deeper than the east corridor, and they were converging on the tower. And behind them, answering, the sound of Kaylor's household guard. The room contracted. We are out of time, Seraphine said, and the political voice was back, sharp and certain. She looked at her border wolves. Get to the stair. Hold the... My men will take yours apart, Kaylor said. Your men are half deployed to the outer wall. Mine have been inside for 20 minutes. She met his eyes. I did not come unprepared. Neither did I. He lifted 2 fingers, and the soldiers flanking the door moved. Not toward the border wolves, not yet, but into position, blocking both the window and the main entrance with the coordinated efficiency of men who had rehearsed this. They were going to fight. In the nursery, with the twins. Stop, Lyra said. Everyone stopped. She was not sure afterward why it worked. She had no authority, no wolf, no weapon, no status in any hierarchy either of these people recognized. She was a 13-year-old girl in a borrowed cloak standing between 2 royal cradles. The only thing she had was the twins. Awake now, both of them. Ronan looking at the room with an expression of serious, concentrated alarm. Kale with his face turned into Lyra's shoulder as though if he couldn't see it, it wasn't happening. You're going to fight, she said, in this room, with them in it. Neither monarch responded immediately. They were both looking at her with expressions she couldn't entirely read. Kaylor calculating, Seraphine something else, something more complicated. They will hear every blow and every word, Lyra continued. They are 10 months old and their wolves already respond to every person in a 50-foot radius, and they have been frightened since before midnight. And if you turn this room into a battlefield, you will do damage to them that no healer in either of your territories will be able to fix. She kept her voice steady. She kept it factual, not pleading. She had learned long ago that facts worked better than pleading in rooms full of powerful people. I'm not asking you to stop for my sake. I am not asking you to stop because of anything I want. I am asking you to take this out of this room, and I am asking you to leave your son somewhere they will not see it." A long beat. "She's right," Seraphine said quietly. Kaelor looked at his soldiers, then at the border wolves, then at the queen. He did not look at Lyra again. She thought this was because looking at her had become, very recently, an experience he didn't know what to do with. "East antechamber," he said, and the word was clipped, a concession dressed as a command. 5 minutes. He walked out. The border wolves looked at Seraphine. She nodded, once, and they followed. The room was suddenly completely empty, except for Lyra and the twins. She stood there for a moment in the silence and breathed. Then she sat down on the floor between the cradles, her floor, her spot, the one she'd sat in 100 times in the dark, and she put both boys in her lap, and she breathed slowly and deliberately until her hands stopped shaking. The twins helped. They always helped. Ronan was still in alert mode, watching the door, but he'd accepted the floor as safe enough to sit in her lap without full-body tension, which was something. Kael had come down from her shoulder and was examining her face with that systematic concentration of his, both hands on her cheeks, and she let him look. "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." He patted her cheek once, with the air of someone concluding an assessment. From the antechamber came voices. Not the words, just the shape of them. The cadence of two people who have a long and complicated history having a conversation that is also a negotiation and also an argument, and also, underneath all of it, something else entirely. She didn't try to hear it. Whatever was said in that room in those 5 minutes was not hers to know. She thought about what the queen had said instead, 6 days old. She turned it over. The orphan ward of the court. No record of parents. She'd accepted this her whole life as a fact without examining it, the way you don't examine the foundations of a building until they start to shift. She'd been placed in the palace's care at age 6, which meant there had been some interval, 6 years, between being taken from the nursery and being installed in the kitchen. Where had she been for 6 years? With whom? She thought about the coal warmth, the permeability, the ability to feel other people's wolves without having one of her own. She thought about what Seraphine had said about her mother's eyes. She was the firstborn child of the queen, which made her mind arrived at the word and stopped there, examining it from a careful distance, which made her, by birthright, the crown princess of the Western territories Seraphine had claimed when she left, which made her, by some interpretation of a law she didn't know the specifics of, potentially an heir. She was 13 years old, and she had been scrubbing pots for 7 years, and she had no wolf, and the most powerful king in 7 territories had told her she was nothing, and she was sitting on the floor of the royal nursery with both royal heirs asleep in her lap, and apparently her mother was the woman who had just walked into the palace with an army to take those heirs back. She exhaled. "This," she told the sleeping princes, "is a lot." Ronan, without opening his eyes, made a sound of agreement. Kaelor came back alone. He walked into the nursery and stood in the doorway and looked at Lyra on the floor with his sons, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He looked different than he had, not physically. He was still the same large, dark, contained presence he'd been since the first time he'd walked into this room and found her here. But something in the arrangement of his face had changed, something that she associated not with defeat, but with a kind of reckoning. The expression of a man who has been handed information that alters the context of everything preceding it and is sorting through the implications in real time. He crossed the room and sat, not stood, sat, in the chair near the fire, which she had never seen him do, and looked at her. "She's leaving," he said. "Tonight. I've given her an hour to clear the palace grounds before I mobilize the full guard. And her forces outside the walls? Will stand down if she does. If—" He was quiet for a moment. "It's a temporary arrangement. It buys us time." "Time for what?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who isn't accustomed to being questioned by kitchen servants and is currently too altered by recent events to muster the usual response to it. "Negotiation. Potentially." He paused. "The twins will not be moved to the inner keep. For now." She held very still. "Why?" she asked. Because my sons trust you, he said, and the words came out flat and precise and clearly cost him something to say. And because I have spent 10 months watching healers and nursemaids and physicians fail to do what you do every time you walk into this room, and because... He stopped. His jaw worked. Because apparently the situation is more complicated than I understood. A pause. Is she telling the truth? Lyra asked quietly. About who I am. He looked at her for a long time. His wolf was reading her. She could feel it. The same assessment she'd felt on the stair that first night, except more prolonged, more deliberate, more like something that is arriving at a conclusion it didn't expect. I don't know, he said, but I intend to find out. His eyes moved to the twins in her lap. She is your mother, if what she claims is true. If it's true. If it's true, he was still looking at his sons. Which would make you... He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't finish it for him. I want to speak with her, Lyra said, before she leaves, alone. He looked at her. She thought he was going to refuse. Thought she could see the refusal forming, the reassertion of hierarchy, the reminder that she was not in a position to make requests of kings. He stood up without speaking and walked back to the door. You have 20 minutes, he said, and left. Seraphine came in quietly. She closed the door behind her and stood near it for a moment, as though she wasn't sure of her welcome, which was an interesting quality in a woman who had just infiltrated a palace with an armed force. She looked at Lyra on the floor, and at the sleeping twins, and at the space between them. May I... she started. Sit down, Lyra said. The queen sat, not in the chair, on the floor a few feet away, which surprised Lyra. She folded herself down with the careful grace of someone who has learned to move in armor and court dress and everything in between, and she sat on the stone floor of the nursery in her battle gear and looked at her daughter. I have 13 years of questions, Lyra said. I know you have 20 minutes, so I need you to be very specific. All right. Were you going to come back for me? Before all of this? Before the army? Before tonight? Seraphine held her gaze. Yes, when the political situation had stabilized. When I had enough leverage to bring you into my court, under conditions that would protect you, rather than endanger you, it was, she paused, taking longer than I planned. And if the situation had never stabilized? A long pause. I don't know, she said. And it had the quality of honesty. Not the queen's political voice, not the calculated admission, but something rawer, something that had been waiting to be said to someone. I don't know what I would have done. I told myself there would be a right moment, and I waited for it, and the months became years, and She stopped. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry. What is my wolf? Lyra asked. Seraphine blinked. Everyone says I don't have one. The palace, the records, everyone who's ever looked at me. But I can feel other wolves. I've always been able to feel them. I can calm the twins in ways that no wolf can. So what is happening? What am I? Seraphine was very still. My mother, she said carefully, was the last of the Veil Walkers. That is what her line were called. Wolves born with an internal wolf, one that doesn't shift, one that works differently. They don't change form, but they feel everything that other wolves feel, carry everything other wolves carry, and they can do things with pack bonds that full shifters can't. She looked at Lyra with those pale eyes. It skips generations, usually. I don't have it. Your grandmother had it completely, and it appears, she paused, that you have it too. Perhaps more strongly than she did. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences in this room tonight. It was not the silence of danger, or confrontation, or shock. It was something closer to the silence of a door opening, the specific quality of a space that was previously closed becoming available. Lyra thought about every person who had told her she was nothing. Every careful, consistent message delivered over years. Wolfless, less, hollow one. She thought about the coal warmth in her chest, the things she'd refused to let them take. I have a wolf, she said. It was not a question. You have something that functions as one, Seraphine said quietly. Something older and rarer and considerably harder to understand than a standard shift, which is why she stopped herself. Which is why you hid me. Which is why I made a decision I am not proud of and have spent 13 years living with. She met Lyra's eyes directly. It was wrong. I can explain it and I can contextualize it, and I can tell you every reason I thought I had, and I will, if you want me to. But underneath all of it, it was wrong. And you are sitting on a floor between my son's cradles in a palace where you have spent 7 years being told you were nothing, and there is no version of this conversation where I don't have to say that to you plainly. Another long-held pause. I'm not ready to forgive you, Lyra said. Charge said, I'm not asking you to, but I want to know you. She said it carefully, examining each word as it came out. I want to understand what I am. I want to understand where I come from, and I want... She paused. I want my brothers back, someday. Seraphine looked at the twins. Something moved across her face, large and slow, like a weather system. They are yours, she said softly. They were always yours. They knew it before anyone else did. From somewhere deeper in the palace, a horn sounded. One short blast. Warning, 20 minutes elapsed. Seraphine stood. I'm going to win this war, she said, and the queen's voice was back. Certain, cold, precise. Or I'm going to negotiate terms that protect my sons and make them safe. And when either of those things happens, she looked at Lyra, I want you with me, not as a servant, not as a ward of any court, as my daughter. She moved to the door. One more question, Lyra said. Seraphine stopped. The people who kept me for those 6 years, between when you left me and when I came to the palace, who were they? A pause that was a fraction too long. Friends, Seraphine said. People I trusted. Are they still alive? Another pause. Some of them. She walked out. Kaelor came back a few minutes later, as she had known he would, because the King of Vaildor was not a man who left loose ends unmonitored. He stood in the doorway and looked at her in a way that she was beginning to recognize, that specific reading quality, his wolf doing something that his face didn't fully show. She had transferred the twins to their cradles, finally. Both were deeply asleep, the sleep of small children who have exhausted themselves being terrified and then, unexpectedly, safe. She had stood over them for a while, watching them breathe. She's gone? Lyra asked. Clearing the grounds now? He crossed to the cradles and looked down at his sons. For a long moment he was simply a man looking at sleeping children, without the king around him, without the sword and the battle gear and the accumulated authority. She had never seen him like that before. She wasn't sure she was supposed to be seeing it now. I owe you an apology, he said, still looking at the twins. She waited. For the insult to the throne comment. He said it with the stiffness of a man who says these words rarely and doesn't have a practiced delivery for them. When I first found you here, several months ago, you were protecting your sons. I was protecting a hierarchy. He looked up. There's a difference, and the hierarchy was wrong in this case. She held his gaze. I'm still a kitchen servant, she said. That isn't changed by... Not for much longer, he said. Whatever else happens, whatever the outcome with Seraphine, you are not sleeping in the servants' dormitory. You will be assigned a proper chamber. His voice had gone back to the command-issuing cadence, which she thought was probably how he managed things that felt large by making them administrative. And you will have a formal role in the nursery. Not servant, not staff. Something else. We will determine what to call it. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Something in his voice shifted. I am choosing to. There's a difference between those things also. A long pause. Thank you, she said. He nodded, once. Then he turned to leave, and she noticed, as he reached the door, that the sword was no longer drawn. Your Majesty, she said. He stopped. She told me what I am, what a veil walker is. She watched him hear this, watched some confirmation arrive in his posture. Did you know, before tonight? He was quiet for a long moment. There were stories, he said. Old ones. I thought they were. He paused. I dismissed them. Because you believed I was nothing. He didn't deny it. Because I believed what I was taught to believe, he said, and the distinction seemed to matter to him. About wolves, about rank, about what power looks like and where it comes from. He looked at her from the doorway. I appear to have been incompletely educated. He left. She stood alone in the nursery with two sleeping princes and the cooling fire and the gray pre-dawn light beginning at the windows. She did not feel like a princess. She did not feel like the heir to the Western Territories or the lost firstborn or the veil walker or any of the things she apparently now was. She felt like Lyra, tired, barefooted, cracked-handed Lyra, who had been told she was nothing for so long that her entire architecture had been built around quietly, stubbornly insisting she wasn't. She was something. She had always been something. She had just finally been given the name for it. She was assigned a chamber on the second level of the West Wing, far from the servants' dormitory. It was small, a real room, with a real door that locked, and a window that looked onto the inner courtyard, and a bed that had a frame and a proper mattress instead of a cot with a rope base. She sat on the edge of it that first night and looked at the room and didn't know what to do with herself. Below stairs, news traveled fast. By the following evening, Dre had apparently stopped making the wolfless girl jokes. Petra had relocated from the nursery night shift to something more senior without anyone officially explaining why, though the implication was clear enough. Oswin had been assigned to the West Wing service corridor, which put him in proximity to her new chamber, which she suspected was not accidental. The court, above stairs, was another matter. She had moved out of invisibility and into a new kind of visibility, and visibility was not, she was rapidly discovering, comfort. The court wolves who had never noticed her before now noticed her with the specific focused attention of people who are trying to determine a threat level. She heard things said in corridors, not cruelly, or not only cruelly, but with the particular unease of a community whose hierarchy has just been unexpectedly complicated. Wolfless, they still said. Just more quietly now, with more of a question behind it. She held the cold warmth in her chest and let it wash off her the way she'd learned to, and she went to the nursery every evening, and she sat between the cradles, and she hummed. It was 3 weeks after the night of the incursion when Kylor called her to his study. She went because refusing was not a real option, and because she was curious in the bone-deep way she'd always been curious, the way that had gotten her up a stair she wasn't supposed to climb, and into a room she wasn't supposed to be in, and into everything that had followed. The study was nothing like the nursery. It was a room built for authority, dark wood, maps, the controlled clutter of a man who uses a space to think and doesn't perform tidiness for anyone. He was at his desk when she came in, and he did not look like a king who had been surprised by a kitchen servant's lineage. He looked like a man who had spent 3 weeks assimilating new information and had arrived at something. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "The intelligence from the border has changed," he said without preamble. "Seraphine has moved, not aggressively. She's pulled back 30 miles from our territory, which is unusual. My scouts can't determine if she's consolidating or retreating." He looked at Lyra. "Do you have any insight into what she might be doing?" "I spent 20 minutes with her," Lyra said. "I'm not—" "You're her daughter, who she hasn't seen since I was 6 days old." He looked at her. "Can you reach her? Is there a way to—" "No?" She kept her voice even. "I have no way to contact her. I have no relationship with her beyond what happened in this palace 3 weeks ago. I am not a resource you can use to be— I'm not asking you to be a resource." His voice had changed. "I'm asking if you want to." She went quiet. "She wants you with her," he said. "You told me she said that. And whether I like the fact of it or not, she is your mother. And she has something to offer you that I cannot, which is—" He stopped. "Which is the knowledge of what you are, what veil walkers are, what you can do." His jaw tightened. "I do not know what that is. My people don't know what that is. She may." Lyra looked at him across the desk. "You want me to go to her," she said slowly. "I want to end a war," he said. "And I want my son safe. And I am learning, the word cost him something, that there are forms of power I have not understood, and that one of them is currently sitting in a chair in my study, and that dismissing it has not served my kingdom or my children or any of us particularly well. He looked at her steadily. I am asking what you want, Lyra. Not ordering, not commanding, asking. She sat very still. She thought about the Western territories, the borderlands, the camps beyond the Ashwood, the army her mother had built. She thought about Vale Door with its cold stone floors and its hierarchy, and two sleeping princes who grabbed her hair and checked her face to be sure she was still there. She thought about Seraphine on the nursery floor saying it was wrong without flinching from it. She thought about what she was, what she'd always been. The coal warmth. The Vale Walker her grandmother had been and her mother wasn't, and she apparently was. She was 13 years old and the world was presenting itself to her in a completely new shape, and the shape was both more frightening and more promising than anything she had imagined from the kitchen floor. I want to understand what I am, she said, before I decide anything else. He nodded. Then we begin there, he said. Och. She did not hear the messenger arrive that night. She was in her new room, lying on her real bed and staring at the real ceiling, when the sound came. Not the war horn, not the alarm, but boots in the corridor outside her door, moving fast, and voices at the far end of the hall that had the quality of urgency overtaking protocol. She was at the door before the knock came. The soldier on the other side, young, barely older than her, one of the gate guard, was breathing hard. His face had the particular blanched quality of someone delivering news they don't want to deliver. What happened? She asked. Message from the border, he said. From one of the Queen's scouts, He stopped, swallowed. They found something in the Ashwood. Someone. A girl, says the message. He looked at Lyra with the confused, frightened expression of someone who doesn't understand what they're carrying. The message says she was being held by a faction that... Another stop. A faction that apparently knew she would eventually leave the palace, that was waiting for her to leave the palace. The cold hit her sternum before she understood it. They were waiting for me, she said. Not a question. The soldier's face confirmed it. The Queen's scouts got to her before... He stopped again. There was a fight. The girl escaped. But the scouts are saying... He held out a rolled message, hand not quite steady. They're saying whoever had her knew exactly who she was, knew about Vale Walkers, and they weren't working for the Queen. He met her eyes. They were working for someone else, someone who's been watching this palace for longer than the war. Lyra took the message. She unrolled it. At the bottom of the page, beneath the scout's rushed shorthand, was a single symbol. Not words, a symbol, stamped in dark ink, that she didn't recognize, had never seen, and that somehow, at the base of her spine, triggered the same alert response as the sound of a war horn. Someone knew what she was, and they had been waiting. She stared at the symbol for a long time. It was simple, deceptively simple, the kind of mark that could have been a smear or a watermark if you didn't look at it with the particular attention of someone who had spent years reading meaning into small things. A circle, bisected by a vertical line, with two short horizontal marks at the top, like the suggestion of antlers or wings or something that couldn't decide what it was. 7 lines total. She counted them twice. She did not know what it meant. She knew, with the certainty of her own nervous system, that it meant something, that it had been put there deliberately by someone who expected her to see it and expected it to communicate something specific. The soldier was still in the doorway. Who brought this? She asked. A rider came through the east gate, Queen's colors, said it was urgent for the King's ward. He paused on the phrase, King's ward, with the slight confusion of someone who had received new information about her status recently and was still integrating it. She left immediately after. The gate guard didn't detain her. What did she look like? Scarred, he said, along the jaw. A woman, maybe 30, 35, moved like a soldier but wasn't wearing full kit. One of the border pack markers on her collar, but not the Queen's direct command insignia. A border wolf, an independent or near independent, someone who served Seraphine's cause but not under direct command, someone who had been in the Ashwood. Thank you, she said. Tell the king I need to speak with him. It's past midnight. Tell him now, she said. He went. She stood in her doorway and looked at the symbol again and thought about a faction that had known she would leave the palace, that had been waiting for her to leave the palace, that knew about Veil Walkers. There was a war assembling itself around her, had been assembling itself for months, with her at the center of it without her knowledge, the way storms assemble around a particular pressure point long before the visible weather begins. The war between Kaelor and Seraphine was real. The political calculus, the armies, the border tensions, all of it was real, and all of it mattered, and none of it was actually what this was about. This was about her. She had been a prize before she was a person. She had been a piece on a board she hadn't known existed, moved without her knowledge, protected without her consent, hunted without her awareness. And now, at 13 years old, with a borrowed cloak and cracked hands, and a new room she didn't yet know how to live in, she was going to have to decide what she was going to do about that. She rolled the message back up and held it and waited for the king. Kaelor arrived in less than 5 minutes, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. He came without his sword, which she noted. He was in a plain dark shirt and trousers rather than any kind of formal or martial dress, and without the armor of his public presentation, he looked, not smaller, nothing about Kaelor of Veildor suggested smallness, but more human in some specific way that she hadn't been allowed to see before. She handed him the message without preamble. He read it. His face did not change, but something around the eyes tightened in the way she'd come to read, as his version of significant reaction. The symbol, she said. Do you know it? Yes? He handed it back. It's old, pre-kingdom, from before the Veildor territories were unified. It belongs to a line of wolf scholars, not fighters, not politicians. They study the old bloodlines, the rare ones. He looked at her. They have been looking for a Veil Walker for a very long time. Why? He was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. Because the last Veil Walker who came to full power, he said carefully, ended a war by walking between both armies and simply making them stop. She didn't fight. She didn't negotiate. She walked into the center of it, and she did whatever it is that Veil Walkers do, at full strength, and 2 armies of several thousand wolves each laid down their weapons and went home. He paused. That was 200 years ago. There hasn't been a fully realized Veil Walker since. The scholars have been cataloging the bloodlines, waiting. Lyra held very still. And they want to study you, he said, and the flat precision of it was its own kind of warning. Or use you, or both. The distinction would depend on who among them found you first and what they decided you were worth. His jaw tightened. The faction that had the girl in the ashwood, whoever they are, they didn't intend to harm her. The scout's report says the conditions were controlled. A camp, not a cell. They were waiting to establish contact. His eyes met hers. But waiting to establish contact is not asking. And the person I am describing to you, the girl they were waiting for, has not yet been asked what she wants. The silence was long and specific. I was never asked what I wanted, she said. No, he said. You weren't. I didn't ask. Your mother didn't ask. Something moved across his face. I am asking now. What do you want, Lyra? She thought about it. She thought about the cold warmth and about 2 armies and a woman who had walked between them. She thought about Ronan's laugh and Kael's hands on her face. She thought about Seraphine on the nursery floor saying it was wrong without flinching, and about the queen's pale eyes recognizing her before she'd introduced herself. She thought about the symbol with its 7 lines, and the people who had been cataloging bloodlines and waiting for her without her knowledge, and the fundamental wrongness of being a piece moved on a board you didn't know existed. I want to understand what I am, she said, on my own terms. Not studied, not used, understood. By me first, by anyone else after. She looked at the king. And I want to go to the Ashwood. He didn't answer immediately. It's not safe, he said finally. The border situation, it's my mother's territory now, or near enough, and the people who were waiting for me in that camp, they backed off when the scouts came. They're not violent, They're cautious. She was thinking out loud, and she let him hear it because the era of performing blankness for this man seemed to be over. I want to know what they know. About veil walkers. About what I can do. I can't fight a war I don't understand, and I can't be used as a piece if I know the board. Kaylor looked at her for a long time. You are 13 years old, he said. I'm aware. The Ashwood is not a safe passage, even in peacetime, which this is not. There are 3 packs that claim overlapping territory in the border corridor, none of them aligned with either Seraphine or myself, and all of them will read an unescorted girl as, then don't send me unescorted. A pause. I don't have soldiers to spare right now. I don't want soldiers. She'd been turning this over since the messenger left, and it had arrived at a shape she recognized. I want someone who knows the Ashwood, a guide, someone who can move through border territory without triggering pack responses. She held his gaze. You have trackers, scouts who work outside standard military structure, someone like that. He studied her face. If I send you, he said slowly, with a guide to the border territory, there's no guarantee Seraphine's people will receive you. There is no guarantee the Scholars faction won't try to intercept again, this time without the scouts to interrupt them. There is no guarantee you come back before the military situation deteriorates past the point where a negotiated peace is possible. I know, she said. And if you are captured by anyone, any faction, your status as... He stopped, reassembled the sentence. Your existence complicates things significantly for both sides. I know that too. He stood in the corridor outside her door in his plain dark shirt at past midnight and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. You're serious, he said. I've always been serious, she said. People just didn't notice because I was scrubbing their floors. Something moved in his face that was, she thought, almost a smile. It came and went fast, like something that wasn't ready to stay yet. I'll have someone at the east gate before dawn, he said. His name was Bram. She received this information from the gate guard at the 5th hour of the morning, gray pre-dawn light turning the eastern sky from black to a dark, reluctant blue. The kind of light that hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. The gate guard, a wolf with a soldier's posture and the careful non-expression of someone who has been given unusual instructions and is following them without comment, gestured toward a figure waiting in the shadow of the gate archway. She looked. He was not what she'd expected, though she realized as she approached that she hadn't formed a clear expectation, which was unlike her. He was tall, broader than he looked at first because the bulk was carried economically, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to use movement unless it's necessary. He had a scar that ran from the left corner of his jaw up toward his cheekbone, not the scar the messenger had described, that had been a woman, but his own, older, the kind that had healed well and sat pale and smooth against darker skin. He was perhaps 30, and he had the face of someone who had spent considerable time in conditions that required vigilance, which had made certain expressions habitual, watching, assessing, waiting. He looked at her with gray eyes that were doing the same calculation she was doing. You're the girl, he said. You're the guide, she said. A pause that was its own kind of introduction. Bram, he said. Lyra. He looked at her for another moment, at her borrowed cloak, at her cracked hands, at the rolled message she still carried, and something in his expression shifted, not warmly, exactly, more like the particular acknowledgement of one person by another who recognizes something specific. You've never been in the Ashwood, he said. It wasn't a question. No. You've never been outside the palace walls? No. The king told me you want to cross to the border corridor and make contact with the Scholars faction. Yes. He looked at the sky, looked at the gate, looked back at her. All right, he said, and picked up his pack. The Ashwood in late autumn was nothing like she'd imagined it from the kitchen, from the stories she'd absorbed below stairs, from the shadows she could see through the pantry window on clear days when the trees were visible at the edge of the southern fields. She had built it in her mind as dark and theatrical, the kind of woods that exist in cautionary stories, dense, cold, full of meaningful shadows. The reality was both less dramatic and more demanding. It was vast. That was the first thing. The way it absorbed you within the first half-mile and made the palace disappear, not dramatically but simply, the way anything large and present makes smaller things irrelevant. The trees were enormous, older than anything in Valedor, with root systems that broke through the frozen ground in ridges she had to step over constantly, and a canopy that filtered the early morning light into something diffuse and directionless that made it hard to tell east from west. Bram moved through it like someone who had been moving through it for years, which he apparently had. He didn't explain much, not because he was unfriendly, she came to understand, but because he communicated differently, more in the selection of direction than in words, more in what he pointed to without speaking than in what he narrated. She followed him and paid attention and tried to learn the grammar of it. "Don't step there," he said, the first time, pointing to a section of ground that looked identical to everything around it. She didn't step there. Why? "Soft, the root has rotted underneath. You'd go into your knee." She cataloged this. She cataloged everything. The way he tracked, the way he stopped and listened at intervals, the way he read the wind by going still in a specific way that was different from his ordinary stillness. She had always been a student of other people's competencies, having had no one to formally teach her anything, and Bram's particular competency was worth studying. He noticed her noticing. On the second day, he started explaining without being asked. "The packs that overlap in this corridor, there are 3. The Grey Cloaks hold the northern track, the Ashran pack holds the central belt, and there's a dispersed group in the southern ridge that doesn't have a formal name. All 3 are wolf sovereign, which means they don't recognize Valedor authority, and they don't recognize the Queen's claim either. They manage the corridor by a system of scent boundaries and challenge protocols that have been stable for about 40 years. He glanced at her. "Which means if we move carefully and don't cross the boundaries and don't present as anything other than travelers, they'll likely leave us alone." "Likely," she said. "The Ashwood doesn't do certainties," he said. She accepted this. The cold was worse than she'd anticipated. She had a cloak, and she had her kitchen boots, and she had the thin wool dress that was entirely inadequate for sleeping on frozen ground, which she discovered on the first night when even the fire Bram built, small and tactical, just enough warmth without enough light to signal their position, couldn't prevent her from waking at the second hour unable to feel her feet properly. She didn't complain. She got up and moved in small circles until the feeling came back, and then sat closer to the fire and stared at the coals and thought. On the third morning, Bram handed her a pair of heavier socks from his pack without looking at her. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I need you functional." She put them on. They were warm. She noted the precise quality of the warmth and stored it next to the coal warmth in her chest and didn't say anything else about it. Yet, it was on the 4th day that her ability did something new. They were crossing the central belt. Ashran territory, Bram had told her, moving carefully, staying well south of the primary scent boundary, when she felt it. Not the slow permeability she was used to, the background hum of other wolves' feelings coming through her like weather. This was different, sharper, directional. She stopped. "What?" Bram said, immediately still. "There's..." She didn't know how to explain it. "There are wolves ahead, not far. They're..." She held still, attending to the thing she felt, trying to read it the way she'd learned to read the twins. "They're not hostile, they're watchful. 3 of them, I think. No, 4. One of them is..." She frowned. "Afraid. The others aren't, but that one is afraid." Bram looked at the trees ahead of them. His hand had moved to the blade at his belt. "Ashran patrol," he said quietly. "They shouldn't be this far south. They're not coming toward us. They're watching." "How do you know?" "I can feel their attention," she said simply. "It has a direction. It's pointed at us, but it's not moving." He looked at her sidelong, not with skepticism. She'd half expected skepticism and had prepared for it, but with the expression of someone integrating new information into an existing model. "Since when?" "I don't know. It happened just now, differently than before." She kept her attention on the feeling, that directional awareness. There's something else, the afraid one. The fear changed. It's not afraid of us. It was afraid before we got here. She paused. It's hurt, I think. Bram was very still. You're telling me a wolf patrol is stopped in those trees and one of them is injured and afraid? Yes. A long pause in which she could feel him weighing things. If we go around, he said, we lose about 3 hours and we have to cross closer to the northern boundary, which is riskier than the central belt. Or we could help them, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between resigned and curious. We are 2 people crossing Ashran territory without permission. Approaching their patrol to render assistance is what a person does when another person is hurt, she said, regardless of territory. Another long pause. You're going to do it anyway, he said. I'm going to do it anyway, she confirmed. He exhaled through his nose. Stay behind me until I establish whether the challenge protocol applies. She followed him into the trees. The patrol was 4 wolves in half shift, caught between human and wolf form, the way shifters sometimes held themselves when they needed both the wolf's senses and the human's hands. 3 of them moved into defensive positioning the moment they were aware of Bram and Lyra approaching, which was later than it should have been, which told Lyra before she saw him that the 4th wolf was occupying more of their attention than it should. He was on the ground. Young, she could tell that from 15 feet away, barely older than her, a boy with the Ashran pack marks on his collar and an injury to his left leg that had gone wrong in the cold. She could feel his fear clearly now, that sharp, bright animal distress of something young and hurt and very far from safe. The 3 standing wolves were tense, hostile. One of them said something in the Ashran pack dialect that she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough from the posture. Travelers, Bram said, with the specific cadence of someone who has done this before. Not challenging, passing through the southern corridor with permission of the Vaildor gate. A back and forth in the dialect that she followed by tone rather than words. The standing wolves weren't moving to attack, but they weren't standing down either. And beneath the tension, the cold warmth in her chest was doing something in response to the injured boy's fear. Something she'd felt in milder form in the nursery when the twins were distressed, that impulse to move toward the thing that needed calming. She stepped around Bram. He made a sharp sound, half warning, half something else. But she was already moving. The 3 wolves went rigid. One of them showed teeth. She stopped. She stood very still, with her hands visible, open, at her sides. She looked at the one showing teeth, and she let herself feel what the injured boy was feeling. All of it, the fear and the pain and the specific helplessness of being hurt in a place you can't get out of without help. And she let it show on her face, and she let the thing she always did, the passing of the warmth, move toward the boy on the ground. He stopped whimpering. The 3 standing wolves went from rigid to confused in about 3 seconds. One of them, the one who'd been speaking, looked from Lyra to the boy and back, and his wolf aspect shifted. Not gone, not at ease, but the specific aggressive alertness had downgraded to something more questioning. She didn't speak. She just kept her hands open and let the calm move where it needed to go. The speaking wolf said something to Bram. Bram answered. Another exchange, and then Bram was at her shoulder saying quietly, "They'll let you approach the injured one. Don't touch the others." She crossed to the boy. His leg was bad, not broken, but a deep puncture wound that had been contaminated by the cold ground, the flesh around it hot and swollen even through the chill. She knew nothing about medicine, had no training, had no supplies. She knew what she had. She put her hand over the wound, not touching it, and she sat with it. She felt the infection, the inflammation, the way pain was making his whole body a closed fist. She didn't try to fix it. She understood on some level that wasn't language that the Veilwalker gift was not healing, was not magic in that direct sense. It was something else. It was the ability to take the fear out of the pain, to open the fist, to let a body remember that it was still inside a world that wasn't entirely hostile. The boy's breathing slowed. The 3 standing wolves watched her. She was aware in a separate layer of her attention that Bram was watching her too, with an expression she couldn't see but could somehow feel, the specific quality of someone watching something they didn't expect and are carefully, seriously revising their assessment of. "He needs a healer," she said finally to the speaking wolf. She said it in the common tongue, not knowing if they'd understand. "His pack healer, or any healer, within 2 days. The cold will slow the inflammation, but it won't stop it. The speaking wolf looked at her for a long moment. His wolf aspect was doing the reading, that invisible assessment she'd felt 100 times. He said something to Bram. He says, Bram said carefully, that they'll give us passage through the central belt. Full passage, no challenge, both directions. A pause. He says you smell like the old bloodlines. She looked at the wolf. Tell him thank you, she said. On the 5th day, the scholars found them before they found the scholars. It wasn't aggressive. It was exactly as Kaylor had described, controlled and cautious. A woman stepped onto the path ahead of them at midday, with both hands visible and no weapons drawn, wearing the faded, practical clothes of someone who had been living in the Ashwood for a considerable time. She was perhaps 50, with the scarred jaw that matched the gate guard's description of the messenger. Behind her, Lyra could feel 2 more people in the trees, watchful, still, not threatening. Lyra of Vaildor, the woman said. Just Lyra, she said. The woman's expression shifted slightly. Just Lyra. My name is Corvin. I sent the message. She glanced at Bram, then back. I wasn't sure you'd come. You were clearly sure enough to wait. We've been waiting a considerable time, Corvin said, and something in her voice had the quality of someone choosing words carefully around a feeling that was larger than the words. Longer than you know. Then you can tell me what you know, Lyra said, and I'll tell you what I know, and we'll see what we have between us. She met the woman's eyes. I'm not here to be studied. I'm here to understand myself. If that's acceptable to you, we can talk. Corvin looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. The girl the stories described, she said slowly, was a frightened orphan from a palace kitchen. I was that, Lyra said. I'm also other things. Yes, Corvin said. I can see that. She gestured toward the trees. Come then. The camp was hidden well, 3 days' journey from the palace, settled into a hollow in the Ashwood that used the terrain to break sight lines in every direction. It was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 40 people, a mixture of pack wolves and humans, all with the particular organized focus of a community that has been doing one thing for a very long time. They were studying the old bloodlines. Corvin explained it over a fire that first evening with 3 of her senior scholars, while Bram sat at the edge of the firelight and ate and watched everything with his gray eyes. Veilwalkers were not an anomaly, Corvin said. They were a specific evolutionary development in the wolf bloodlines, and they were not accidents of genetics. They were a response. She paused. You know the historical wars, the ones that nearly ended the wolf territories entirely before Vaildor was unified. Briefly, Lyra said. Kitchen history is limited. A ghost of something in Corvin's expression. The wars almost killed everything. Pack turned on pack, bloodlines were being wiped out systematically. Entire territories fell. And then the Veilwalkers came. Not all at once, gradually, over several generations, appearing in scattered bloodlines that had experienced the most devastating losses. It was as though the bloodlines were producing a correction. She looked at Lyra. Wolves who could feel everything, who could carry the grief of entire packs and still stand, who could walk between armies and remind them what they were, at the level of the animal before the political reasons for fighting had layered themselves over the top. The fire popped. Someone added wood. My grandmother, Lyra said. Alara, yes. The last one to reach full strength. She was extraordinary by every account we have. Corvin met her eyes. And you are her granddaughter, which means I need to learn what she could do, Lyra said. Not so someone else can use it. Because there is a war coming, or already here, depending on how you measure it. And I can feel it the way I can feel a pack's distress, like a pressure building, and I need to understand what I can do before it arrives. Corvin looked at her for a long moment. How old are you? She asked. 13. Alara came to full strength at 17. I don't have until 17. The scholars exchanged glances. No, Corvin said finally. I don't think you do. She stayed in the camp for 8 days. She slept in a proper tent with actual blankets. and she ate food that was better than anything she'd had in the palace kitchen, and she worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life at something she hadn't known she was capable of. Corvin was a good teacher, rigorous, unsentimental, with the particular quality of intelligence that is more interested in accurate information than comfortable information. She pushed Lyra without cruelty, directed without controlling, and corrected without contempt. She was, Lyra thought, the first person who had ever taught her anything on purpose, and the experience was so novel that it took 2 days before she could receive it without bracing for the catch. The Veilwalker gift, Corvin explained, was not one thing. It was several, layered. The permeability, which Lyra had always had, the directional awareness, which had appeared in the Ashwood, and the third layer, which Corvin called the anchor, which was what happened when a fully realized Veilwalker planted themselves in a space of conflict and simply refused to let the conflict be the loudest thing in the room. "You've done it," Corvin said on the third day. "You've been doing it since you were 12, probably. Every time you calmed the twins while the king was in the room, what you were doing was the anchor. You were being more present than the conflict." "That sounds too simple," Lyra said. "It is simple. It is also extraordinarily difficult to maintain its scale under conditions of genuine threat. When your own wolf—" She stopped, corrected herself. "When your own nature is telling you to run." "Mine doesn't tell me to run," Lyra said. Corvin looked at her. "Mine doesn't," she repeated, and thought about every time she'd gone up a staircase she wasn't supposed to climb. "It tells me to go toward the thing that needs the warmth." A long pause. "Yes," Corvin said softly. "Yes, that's it exactly. Yes." On the 6th day, a rider came from Vale Door. Oswin. She'd know his horse's gait anywhere. She'd catalogued it from the stables the same way she'd catalogued everything, and she'd been half expecting someone. Came into the camp hollow with the breathless urgency of someone who had ridden hard and wasn't done yet. She met him at the camp's edge. "The border situation," he said, still on horseback, getting it out fast. "It's breaking. Seraphine's forces moved this morning. Not toward Vale Door, actually. They moved north. There's a third party, a faction the king didn't anticipate, that the queen didn't anticipate either. They came across the northern border with significant force, and they're driving toward the corridor, and—" He stopped, caught his breath. "And they're moving toward the Ashwood." She went very still. "The symbol on the message," she said. "The scholars' symbol." "Not the scholars. The scholars are here. You know they're here." He looked at her with the careful urgency of someone trying to deliver the right information in the right order. "There's a splinter, a faction that broke from Corvin's group 6 years ago. The king's intelligence only identified them this morning. They don't want to study you. They want to control you." He swallowed. "The wolf scholars who want to use a Veilwalker, not to end a war, to win one, for whoever deploys her." Behind her, Corvin had come out of the camp. The scholar stood at the camp's edge and listened, and her face was doing something that Lyra had never seen on a person of that controlled composure, something that looked like guilt and grief, and the weight of something she should have said earlier. "Corvin," Lyra said. "I know," Corvin said. "I know what they want. I know who they are." She met Lyra's eyes directly. "They were my students. Before I understood the distinction between studying a thing and deciding a thing belongs to you." The forest was very quiet around them. Somewhere to the north, she could feel it distantly, that new awareness pointing like a compass needle. Something was moving. Not wolf soldiers. Something more dispersed, more patient, the way a net is more patient than a spear. They were being surrounded. "How long?" she asked Oswin. "A day. Maybe less if they know where the camp is." She turned to Corvin. "Do they know where the camp is?" A pause that was its own answer. "Then we move," Lyra said. "We have 40 people," Corvin said. "Half of them are researchers, not fighters, moving through the Ashwood with a hostile force incoming." "We don't run from them," Lyra said. "We go to the one place they won't follow, the one territory in the Ashwood where they cannot enter without triggering a response from 3 separate packs simultaneously." She looked at Bram. He met her eyes. Understanding arrived in his face a beat before he spoke. "The Convergence Hollow," he said. "The Ashran pack gave us passage," she said. "Both directions. They know my scent now. They know, she paused, finding the words, they know what I am. Not what I am by bloodline, what I am by what I can do. She looked at Corvin. Can you reach the Grey Cloak and Southern Ridge packs? Is there a communication protocol? There are signal markers, Corvin said slowly, but we haven't used them in years. The last time anyone tried to call a convergence of those 3 packs was, how long ago? 40 years. Did it work? A pause. Yes. Then it can work again. She looked around the camp, at the scholars, at the fighters, at the various people who had dedicated significant portions of their lives to a single, long-held purpose. She felt something that was not the coal warmth, was something larger and colder and more demanding. Not fear. She recognized fear from the inside out, had spent enough of her life with it to know its face. This was something else. The feeling of a decision being made not by her rational mind, but by some deeper function that had been calculating quietly for years. We are not going to run, she said. We are going to walk out into the middle of the convergence hollow, and I am going to stand between whatever comes at us and the people this camp represents, and I am going to do what my grandmother could do. She met Bram's eyes. Will you help me get there? He looked at her with those gray, watchful eyes for a long moment. I've been watching you since the first day, he said, and his voice was different than it had been, carrying something more deliberate. In the Ashwood, with the Ashran Patrol, I've watched you do things that should be impossible for someone with no formal training, no pack, no history. He paused. I'll get you there. She turned to Oswin. Ride back to the king. Tell him where we're going and why. Tell him to hold his forces at the Vale Door border and wait. She held the messenger's eyes. Tell him I said wait. Not attack. Wait. Can you do that? Yes, Oswin said. Tell Petra, she started, then stopped. She thought about the nursery. She thought about the twins. Tell Petra they'll be all right, she said. Tell her I said so. He rode. She looked at the camp, at Corvin, at Bram, at 40 people in the amber afternoon light of the Ashwood, who were watching her with varying degrees of uncertainty and something that was, some of them, beginning to look like something else. She was 13 years old. She was wearing borrowed clothes and 2 large boots, and she had cracked hands and no wolf, and 7 weeks ago she had been scrubbing pots in a kitchen and being called Ghost Girl and Hollow One. She was a Veil Walker, the first in 200 years. The Bloodlines' answer to something the Bloodlines had decided needed answering. She picked up her pack. Let's go, she said. And every single person in that camp moved. Not because she commanded them, not because of rank or status or the hierarchy that had spent her entire life telling her she didn't have any. They moved because she had asked them to, in a voice that carried the thing she'd always carried, that coal warmth, that refusal to accept the premise, that deep and unshakable knowledge that she was not nothing. And somewhere in the animal core of every wolf in that hollow, something had recognized it. For the first time in her life, Lyra walked forward and did not hear, in the silence behind her, the sound of people staying still. She heard footsteps, following. The convergence hollow was 3 hours northeast through the Ashwood's densest corridor, and they moved through it as the afternoon light died and the temperature dropped with the particular cruelty of late autumn in the borderlands. Not the gradual dimming of a normal day, but a hard, fast withdrawal of warmth, as though the forest was pulling everything it had back into itself for the night. Lyra walked at the front with Bram, and she did not let herself think about whether this would work. Thinking about whether it would work was the wrong kind of thinking. She had learned this in the nursery, in those early nights when she'd been too aware of what she was attempting to actually do it properly. The gift didn't operate through effort the way physical things did. It operated through presence, through the willingness to be entirely where you were, to stop calculating the margins and simply stand in the center of the thing. She practiced this as she walked. She listened to the 40 sets of footsteps behind her and felt the individual textures of 40 wolves' emotions. The fear, the determination, the confusion, the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from believing in something for a long time and being uncertain whether belief will be enough. She didn't try to change any of it. She just let it come through her, the way she'd let the twins' distress come through her, and held steady and kept walking. The hollow is shaped like a bowl, Bram said beside her, quietly enough that only she heard. Natural depression in the terrain, maybe 200 feet across. Three-pack boundaries converge at the center. That's why it's neutral territory. No single pack can claim it without crossing the other's lines. Historically, it's where disputes were resolved. Or avoided, she said. Same thing sometimes. How far behind us are they? He was quiet for a moment, listening in the way he listened, his whole body oriented differently when he was tracking, something that tilted slightly toward the source of attention. Half a day. Maybe less if they found the signal markers we had to break to redirect their route. A pause. They know we're moving toward the hollow. If they know what you are, they know why. And the three packs? Corvin's signal went out an hour ago. The gray cloaks will respond fastest. They have a standing protocol for convergence calls. The Ashran, he glanced back at her. The Ashran pack word travels through the patrol we met. The injured boy's pack. A beat. That may help or not, depending on how his recovery goes and how the patrol reported what happened. She thought about the boy on the frozen ground, the fear going quiet under her hand. It'll help, she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had spent 8 days recalibrating. You know, he said, when the king's man came to find me and said he needed a guide for a palace girl who wanted to cross the Ashwood, I assumed it was political. A message carrier, maybe. Someone's daughter being moved for strategic reasons. It is political, she said. No. He shook his head slightly. What I've watched for 8 days is not political. Political things don't feel like that. Like what? He was quiet for a moment, as though finding the right words was unusual work for him. Like something that's been waiting a long time, he said finally, to be exactly where it is. She didn't answer. She kept walking. But she held the words somewhere, folded carefully and placed with the coal warmth, and she carried them into the convergence hollow as the last of the daylight left the sky. The hollow was exactly as Bram had described it, a natural bowl carved into the Ashwood's terrain, the trees thinning at its edge and the ground sloping gently inward to a center that was open to the sky in a way that nothing else in the forest was, a circle of cold stars becoming visible overhead as they came to the hollow's rim. It was, she thought, looking down into it, the most exposed place she had ever stood near. No walls, no ceiling, no kitchen floor to scrub, no service corridor to move through undetected, no cradle rail to hold, just open ground and cold air, and the forest watching from every direction. Corvin came to stand beside her. The three boundaries converge at the center, the scholar said. She'd said it before, but said it again as though the repetition was important. Anyone who stands there is standing in the territory of all three packs simultaneously, and therefore the territory of none. It is, she paused, the only truly neutral place in the Ashwood. How long have you known about me? Lyra asked. She kept her eyes on the hollow. Before this month? Before the incursion. How long? A pause that was honest rather than evasive. 7 years, Corvin said, since you came to the palace. The Queen sent me a message when she placed you there. She wanted someone who knew the bloodlines to watch over you, from a distance, in case you showed signs of the gift. A breath. I failed her. I failed you. The Splinter faction saw it. When they realized what I was tracking, they moved before I could. I'm sorry. 7 years of being watched without knowing it. 7 years of being an object of study while scrubbing pots. She thought about being angry. She measured the anger and found it was there, solid, real, warranted, and set it aside deliberately, the way you set aside a tool you'll need later. Not now, not tonight. Can you feel them? She asked instead. The packs, as they come. Corvin shook her head. That's yours alone. She reached out with the directional sense. It had been growing, she'd noticed, over the 8 days with Corvin, opening like something that had always been present, but kept small by the compressed conditions of a palace kitchen. She could feel the Ashwood around her as a network of presences, the camp's 40 wolves behind her, various textures of intention and anxiety. Further out, the Grey Cloak pack moving with focused efficiency through the northern corridor, their approach like a coordinated weight. And from the east, the Ashran patrol, different, less formal, more instinctual, The specific frequency of a pack responding to something that had bypassed their politics and gone directly to the animal. And from the north, further, harder to read, the splinter faction. A different texture altogether. Not the warmth of pack bonds, not the clean directional focus of wolves moving with purpose. Something more calculated, more predatory in the strategic sense, the coldness of people who had decided that a thing was a means, and had therefore stopped seeing it as a person. They were perhaps 4 hours out. She had time. "I'm going to the center," she said. Corvin nodded once. Bram appeared at her other side. He'd been 2 steps away this entire time, she realized, consistently 2 steps away for 8 days, not guarding her in the visible sense, but simply present, which was its own kind of protection. "I'll be at the hollow's rim," he said. "You'll be visible from every point of the tree line." "I know. That includes the splinter faction." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. "If this doesn't go the way you're expecting," he said, "what's the contingency?" She looked down at the hollow, at the circle of stars above its center. "There isn't one," she said. "That's the point." He exhaled. "Right," he said. "Right." She walked down into the hollow. The ground at the center was frozen solid, and the cold came up through her 2 large boots and settled in her feet the way it had every night in the ashwood, and she stood in it and let it be there. Around the rim of the hollow, she could feel Bram taking a position, and behind him the rest of the camp spreading out along the edge, watching, waiting, not following her down because this was not a thing you could do with company. She stood at the convergence point and she breathed. She thought about Cale's hands on her face, checking. Still there. Still here. She thought about Ronan's laugh and the way it always surprised him, the way joy ambushed him, and he wrote it without self-consciousness. She thought about a kitchen at 5 in the morning and the particular quality of silence before the world woke up and became demanding, when she could be exactly what she was without anyone deciding what that meant. She thought about her grandmother, Elara, who had walked between 2 armies and done this, whatever this was, and made them stop. She didn't know exactly what Elara had done. She only knew what it felt like to do the smaller version of it, in a nursery in a palace, with 2 crying boys who needed the world to be steady for 5 minutes. She knew how it worked. You could not force calm on something that was determined to be afraid. You could only make yourself so completely, so genuinely still that the fear had nothing to feed on. And gradually, if the thing that was afraid had enough animal wisdom to recognize genuine steadiness when it was offered, it came toward the stillness, because that was what living things did in the presence of safety. 200 feet across. 40 wolves at the rim, 3 pack territories converging in the ground under her feet. She stood still and she breathed and she let the cold warmth fill her from sternum to fingertips. The gray cloak pack arrived first. She felt them before she saw them. That coordinated weight from the northern tree line, resolving into wolves in half shift, emerging from the tree line in a line that stopped at the hollow's rim. She counted 12, and their alpha, a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and the deliberate carriage of someone who leads by making leading look inevitable, stepped to the edge and looked down at Lyra in the hollow's center. They did not speak. The alpha's wolf was reading her from the rim. That invisible assessment, longer and more thorough than anything she'd experienced before. Lyra let her look. She kept her hands visible and her breathing even and her presence exactly what it was. No more, no less. Not performing steadiness, but being it. After a long moment, the gray cloak alpha stepped back 1 pace. Took a position. Watching. Not challenging. Witnessing. The Ashran came from the east, as she'd expected. The patrol first, and behind them a larger contingent, and at the patrol's front the injured boy walking with a careful gait and the expression of someone who has been specifically asked to be here and understands, at least partly, why. He looked at Lyra in the hollow's center, and she felt the recognition move through him. The same thing she'd felt in his fear on the frozen ground, turned inside out. Not fear now. Something closer to certainty. The southern ridge wolves came last, from the south, wordless and self-contained. Fewer of them, perhaps 8, but their quality of attention was different from the other 2 packs, older and more patient. the way stone is more patient than water. 3 packs: the Grey Cloak Alpha at the north rim, the Ashrun at the east, the Ridge Wolves to the south, 40 scholars and fighters at the west, and Lyra at the center of all of it. What? The splinter faction arrived at the 2-hour mark. She felt them before the sentries signaled. That calculated coldness from the north, resolving into movement and then into people. Perhaps 30 of them, in organized formation, moving with the efficiency of a group that has rehearsed its approach. Their leader was a man she had not seen before, lean, gray-haired, with the wolf scholar's marks on his collar and an expression that was, she thought, genuinely intellectual, not cruel, not sadistic. The specific cold focus of a person who has spent so long pursuing an idea that the idea has become more real to him than the people it involves. He came to the hollow's northern rim and stopped. He looked at the 3 packs ranged around the edge. He looked at Corvin's 40 at the west. He looked down at Lyra at the center barefoot. She had taken her boots off because the ground at the convergence point felt important to be in direct contact with, and she was aware this was not a rational decision, but made it anyway. He looked at all of this for a long time. Then he descended. Not aggressively. He walked down the hollow slope with his hands visible, as she had, and he stopped 10 feet from her and looked at her with those cold, curious eyes. "You're younger than we expected," he said. "I'm older than I was," she said. He almost smiled. "My name is Aldrich. I think you know who I am." "I know what you want." "Then you know it isn't harmful," he said, and he believed it. She could feel that, which was in some ways worse than if he hadn't. A veil walker operating at full strength, properly guided, with full understanding of her capabilities. Think of what becomes possible. Conflicts that have lasted generations, resolved in days. Pack wars that have killed thousands, ended without a single— "With whose guidance?" she asked. "Yours?" "With the guidance of people who understand what you are." "I understand what I am," she said. "I understand it better than you do, actually, because I'm the one doing it from the inside." She held his gaze. "You want to use me to end conflicts of your choosing. Resolve the disputes you decide should be resolved. Make the peace that suits your purposes." She kept her voice level. "That is not the same thing as what my grandmother did. She chose. She walked into that field because she had decided it was worth walking into, not because someone deployed her." Something in his expression shifted. Not retreat, not yet, but the first acknowledgement of friction. "You're 13 years old," he said. "You're the third person to say that to me in 2 weeks," she said. "And I've noticed that people say it when they mean something else. They mean I should not yet be trusted to understand my own situation." She looked at him evenly. "But I've understood my situation very clearly for a long time. Since before you knew I existed. Since I was 6 years old and scrubbing floors and being told I was nothing, I understood that the people telling me I was nothing were wrong, and that the wrongness was their problem and not mine." She paused. "I will not be guided by someone who sees me as a correction to a problem rather than a person. I will not be deployed. I will not be studied without my consent or used without my choice. And I will not stand in this hollow and pretend that what you're offering is different from what the king offered when he decided a wolfless kitchen girl was only valuable as a tool for calming his heirs." The hollow was completely silent. "What happens," Aldrich said carefully, "if I choose not to accept that?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the rim, at the 3 packs surrounding the hollow, at the 40 wolves at the west, at Bram's position at the north rim with his gray eyes steady. She looked back at Aldrich, and she let go. Not of anything visible, not of any physical thing. She let go of the careful containment she'd always maintained, the way she'd always kept the cold warmth small and internal and protected, the way years of being told she was nothing had trained her to manage her own presence into something inoffensive and invisible. She simply stopped managing it. The warmth moved outward. She didn't know how to describe what happened next, would spend years afterward trying to find the language for it, and never quite succeeding. It was not a sound, and it was not a light, and it was not any of the theatrical things that stories about power tended to describe. It was more like a pressure shifting, the way the atmosphere changes before weather, that full-body awareness of something large and real. It moved through the hollow in a wave, and it moved through every wolf in the hollow simultaneously, And what it carried was nothing manipulative, nothing false, nothing she had invented or constructed. It carried exactly what she was. Exactly what the convergence of 13 years of refusing to be nothing felt like. From the inside, carried to the outside, offered plainly and without apology. It carried the coal warmth, the knowledge she'd refused to let anyone take. Aldrich went completely still. Not the calculated stillness of a strategic mind pausing to reassess. The deeper stillness of something animal, responding to something more fundamental than strategy. His wolf, she could feel it, that intellectual coldness giving way to the raw, pack-bonded animal underneath. His wolf had received what she'd sent and was sitting with it in a way his rational mind hadn't caught up to yet. Around the rim, the three packs had gone still in the same way. The gray cloak alpha had her hand over her chest, unconsciously, the gesture of someone who has just felt something move through them. The Ashran patrol's injured boy had sat down on the ground at the hollow's rim, not out of weakness, but the way you sit down when something is too large to stand through. Aldrich looked at her. "What?" he started. "That," she said, "is what a veil walker is. Not a weapon, not a tool, not a conflict resolution instrument." She held his gaze. "The thing you felt, that's what happens when a person who has been told their whole life that they are nothing decides, finally, to show exactly what they are." She paused. "You cannot study that without my agreement. You cannot deploy it without my choice. And you cannot take it." She let the warmth settle back into its normal register, the coal again, contained and present and hers. "Now, are we going to talk about what comes next, or are we going to spend more time pretending you have leverage you don't have?" Aldrich stood in the center of the convergence hollow and looked at her for a very long time. Then, in the silence, he sat down on the frozen ground. It was not a posture she had seen before in this context. Not defeat, not submission, not the defeat-adjacent behaviors of a political opponent outmaneuvered. It was the specific, involuntary sitting down of a man who has spent decades pursuing a single idea and has just been shown, for the first time, that the idea was correct, but everything he believed about it was wrong. "All right," he said. His voice had changed. "All right. Talk." It took the better part of the night. She sat across from him on the frozen ground of the convergence hollow, and they talked. Not negotiated, not strategized, but talked. The way she had learned to talk from years of existing in rooms with people who mattered and learning their language by listening. Corvin came down eventually, and the Grey Cloak Alpha, and the Ashran Pack second, and by the third hour they were a council of sorts, assembled in the only truly neutral ground in the Ashwood, assembled by the presence of a 13-year-old girl who was still wearing borrowed socks and had long since lost feeling in her toes. What was decided, it would take months to formalize, years to fully enact, was the shape of something new. The scholar's knowledge of the bloodlines placed in service to the Veil Walker rather than the other way around. The three packs' territorial claims, acknowledged and preserved. And the question of Veil Door and the Queen's territory, that was set aside, because some things require different conversations and different people present. Aldrich, to his credit, did not fight the loss of control. He had the quality of someone who had been wrong about an important thing for a long time, and had the intellectual honesty to accept the correction once it became undeniable. She didn't forgive him, the way she hadn't forgiven Seraphine, the way she hadn't forgiven the years of being called nothing. But she acknowledged him, and accepted his acknowledgement of her, and that was a beginning. Bram appeared at her side at the 5th hour with a blanket and a piece of dried meat and said nothing, which she appreciated more than most things that had been said to her all night. "Thank you," she said. "I said don't thank me," he said. "I know. I'm still thanking you." He made a sound that was probably not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Dawn came. Oswin arrived before midday. Not alone. He came with a small company of riders, and at the head of them, in riding clothes rather than battle gear, Kalor of Veil Door. Lyra stood at the hollow's rim as the riders came through the Ashwood's edge, and she watched the king take in what she had assembled in one night. 3 sovereign packs, 40 scholars, a council that had no formal name yet but had a shape, and at the center of it, a girl in borrowed clothes who had, it appeared, reorganized the political landscape of the entire borderland corridor while he was waiting for her message. He dismounted. He looked at her. "You told me to wait," he said. "You waited," she said. "I held my forces at the border for 15 hours. Something in his voice, not quite admiration, not quite its opposite, something more honest than either. My war council was not pleased. I imagine not. He looked at the hollow, at the council still assembled, at the 3 packs whose alphas had not left, at the splinter faction's leader sitting at the edge of things in the cooperative posture of someone who has had a significant recalibration. "What did you do?" Kaylor asked. "What needed doing?" she said. "I stood at the center and I didn't leave." She met his eyes. "That's all it was." He looked at her for a long moment with those silver eyes that had first looked at her in this calculating, unsure way months ago in the nursery. "That's not all it was," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, "but that's the simplest version." A pause. "Seraphine is here," he said, "or nearby. Her scouts identified the convergence call signal, and she followed. She's held at the Ashwood's eastern edge." He watched Lyra's face. "She's asking if she may come." Lyra was very still for a moment. She thought about her mother on the nursery floor. It was wrong. Said without flinching, without political softening, without the negotiated language of courts. She thought about what forgiveness was, separate from what it wasn't. She had been turning this over for weeks, turning it over since the nursery, trying to find where the line was. She had concluded tentatively that forgiveness was not the same as trust, was not the same as love, was not the same as understanding. It was a thing you did not for the person who had wronged you, but for the person you wanted to become. It was a door you opened not because they deserved access, but because you refused to live in a sealed room. She was 13 years old, and she had been told she was nothing for her entire life. And she was standing in an Ashwood clearing, having spent the night doing something no Wolfborn had done in 200 years. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. The premise had always been wrong. "Tell her yes," Lyra said. Best. Seraphine came on foot without her border wolves, which was itself a statement. She walked through the Ashwood to the hollow's edge, and she stopped there and looked at her daughter. She looked at her for a long time without speaking. "You called a 3-pack convergence," she said finally. "Yes." "At 13 years old with no formal training." 8 days of training, Lyra said, "with Corvin." Something moved across Seraphine's face. She looked at Corvin, who had come to stand at Lyra's left, and the look that passed between them was long and layered and belonged to a history that Lyra was only beginning to understand. "You're all right," Seraphine said to Lyra. Not a question, and arriving, the particular verbal form of a breath held for a long time finally released. "I'm all right," Lyra said. The queen crossed the hollow's rim and came down toward her daughter, and she stopped 3 feet away and looked at her with those pale eyes that Lyra had inherited in some modified form and now recognized as her own. "I don't know how to do this," Seraphine said. It was said plainly, without the political voice, in the tone of a person stating a fact they'd been afraid to name. "I know how to build alliances. I know how to negotiate territory. I know how to raise an army and manage a court and keep myself alive in a world that has tried several times to prevent it." She paused. "I don't know how to be your mother. I don't have practice. I gave that up when I made the choice I made, and I am aware that I cannot simply reclaim it." Lyra looked at her. "Neither do I," she said, "know how to do this." Seraphine blinked. "I've never had a mother," Lyra continued. "I don't have a model for it. I don't know what it's supposed to feel like, or what we're supposed to do, or how long it takes before 2 people who are strangers to each other with a history that complicated become whatever we could become." She kept her voice even. "What I know is that I have spent 13 years in a world that kept telling me I didn't belong anywhere, and I have never, not once, believed them. And you are the first person I have ever met who made a choice, a wrong choice, a choice that hurt me, specifically because of how much you wanted me to belong somewhere safe." She paused. "That doesn't make it right," she said, "but it makes it different from nothing." Seraphine's composure did something in the silence, held, and then very slightly, at the edges, didn't. "Different from nothing," she repeated softly. Different from nothing, Lyra said. That's where we start, if you want to. Yes, Seraphine said. Her voice was rough. Yes, I want to. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Seraphine did something that Lyra had not expected and could not have prepared for. She opened her arms, not with the certainty of someone who knows they have the right, but with the tentativeness of someone making an offer they're afraid will be refused. Lyra stood very still. She thought about being 6 days old and carried out of a palace. She thought about 7 years of cold water and gray dresses and being called nothing. She thought about the nursery floor, about 2 boys who had taught her what it felt like to be needed completely. She thought about what it was to choose, in the absence of certainty, to move toward the thing that needed the warmth. She stepped forward. Her mother's arms came around her, and for the first time in 13 years, Lyra of Vale Door, Lyra of the Borderlands, Lyra the Veil Walker, Lyra the Firstborn, Lyra who had always known she was not nothing, stood somewhere that had the shape of belonging. She didn't cry. She had learned very long ago how to carry large things without spilling them. But she stood in her mother's arms, and she let the cold warmth move outward, as far as it would go, past the hollow's edge, and through the ashwood, and somewhere, distantly, through the pack bonds of every wolf within its range. And somewhere in Vale Door Palace, 2 small princes woke from their midday sleep with simultaneous bright expressions and grabbed the nearest nursemaid and announced, in wordless, emphatic, 10-month-old terms, that something good had just happened. Petra would tell her this later. She would believe it. What came next took months. It was not simple. The war did not end in the hollow that night. Wars don't end in single nights, regardless of what moments happen in them. There were negotiations that lasted weeks, with Kaelor's war council and Seraphine's border generals and the 3 pack alphas and the scholars, all trying to find the shape of something that had never existed before in the territory's history. There were setbacks. There were days when Lyra sat in a borrowed tent at the hollow's edge and felt the tension of it pressing at her from all directions, each faction pulling at the conversation with the particular urgency of people who have been fighting for a long time and don't entirely know how to stop. She held the center. That was what she did. That was what she had apparently always done without knowing it had a name or a history or a bloodline behind it. She sat at tables and in clearings and in councils where people with more formal power than she would ever claim argued past each other, and she let the cold warmth go outward, and she waited for the moment. It always came, eventually, when the animal underneath the politics was calmer than the words on top of it. In those moments, things became possible. Bram stayed. He had not said formally that he was staying, had not announced it, or offered it as something she should be grateful for. He had simply continued to be 2 steps away, which after the Ashwood she had come to understand as its own language. He was a rogue wolf, independent of every formal pack structure, and this turned out to be exactly the kind of person she needed in the first months of building something that didn't yet have a name. "You have no self-preservation instinct," he told her once, on a night when the negotiations had gone particularly badly and she had spent 4 hours in a council tent being the only calm thing in a room full of people who were not. "I have self-preservation instinct," she said. "I've been preserving myself since I was 6. That's different from the kind that makes normal people leave rooms that are too dangerous." "I know." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He was quiet for a moment. "It means you need someone to watch the rooms you won't leave," he said. "I can do that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say, "Don't thank me this time." Kaelor came to the Hollow twice during the negotiation months. The second time, he came alone, without his war council, and he found her at the Convergence Center because that was where she went when she needed to think. He sat down on the frozen ground. It was deep winter now, the cold a serious and present thing. And he looked at the stars through the Hollow's open sky, and they sat in silence for a while in the way that had, gradually, become possible between them. "Ronan said his first word last week," he said eventually. She looked at him. Maid documented it. First clearly intentional word, repeated 3 times with consistent meaning. He paused. "It was your name." She was very still. "He says other things now," Kaelor continued, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant it was carrying something he was managing. "But that was first. He looked at the stars. Kale won't say anything yet. The physicians say it's normal, some children take longer, but Kale watches everything and waits, which... He stopped. Which is Kale, she said. Yes. He was quiet. They ask for you. Ronan has learned to pull Petra to the door of the nursery and point down the corridor and make extremely clear what he means. Petra finds it alternately charming and exhausting. Something in his voice. I find it, he paused for a long time, a reminder of what I nearly did. She didn't say anything. She let the silence hold it. I nearly executed a girl for caring for my sons, he said. It was said flatly, directly, in the way he said things when he had decided they needed to be said, and sentiment wouldn't change the fact of them. A 13-year-old girl, because she had no wolf, and I had been taught that no wolf meant nothing, and I had never... He stopped, jaw tightened. I had never questioned the premise. You weren't the only one, she said. I was the one with the authority to act on it, he said. That's different. A long pause in which only the wind moved through the hollow's trees. I'm not asking you to forgive that, he said. I'm telling you I understand what it was. She looked at him. At this man who had told her she was an insult to the throne, and then told her she was not sleeping in the servants' dormitory, and then held his forces at the border for 15 hours on her word alone. People change, she said, when they're given information that changes them. She met his eyes. You were given it. You changed. She paused. That's not nothing either. He looked at her for a long moment with those silver eyes that Ronan had inherited. You are very strange, he said, and it was not an insult. It had the quality of an observation made with something close to wonder. I know, she said. I've always known. The agreement, when it was finally signed at the Hollow's center on a day in early spring when the ashwood was beginning to wake up, and the convergence point smelled of cold mud and new things, was not what any single party had wanted. It was instead what all of them could live with, which Corvin told her was what good agreements looked like from the inside. Seraphine retained sovereignty of the Western Territories. Kalor retained Vale d'Or. The three packs retained full territorial sovereignty in the border corridor, acknowledged formally by both crowns for the first time in the territory's recorded history. The scholars, Corvin's faction and Aldrich's, now formally merged under terms that Aldrich had negotiated with visible gratitude for the opportunity to negotiate anything, were established as an independent body answerable to no crown and everyone simultaneously. And the Veil Walker, the agreement named her by that title, the first formal political document in 200 years to do so, was recognized as belonging to no faction and accountable to no authority but her own judgment and the traditions of the bloodline. She signed it last. She had been practicing her signature for 3 weeks in private, which she found faintly absurd and entirely sensible. She had no education beyond what she'd taught herself from discarded documents in the palace kitchens. Her handwriting was improving rapidly, but was not yet the elegant script of court education. She signed it anyway. Lyra, with the 7-line Veil Walker symbol beneath. Not Lyra of Vale d'Or. Not Lyra, daughter of Seraphine. Not Lyra, ward of the crown. Just Lyra. The name she'd had before anyone decided what it was attached to. The name she'd carried through 7 years of cold water and borrowed clothes and a cold warmth nobody could find, because nobody had thought to look. Corvin handed her the pen. Your grandmother would have... she started. I know, Lyra said. But I'm not her. I'm me. She looked at the document. That's the point, isn't it? That's always been the point. She signed. On the day she finally came back to Vale d'Or Palace, it was spring. The courtyard smelled of new grass and the particular cold stone and warmth combination of a palace waking up after winter, and the gates were open the way they always were in spring, and the guard on the gate was one she recognized. The same man who had almost stopped her on the stair that first night, what felt like an entirely different life ago. He looked at her when she came through. Then he looked at the company she arrived with. Seraphine on her left, riding with the formal bearing of a queen making an official visit rather than an infiltration. Bram on her right, because Bram was always 2 steps away, Corvin somewhere behind with her scholars, and at Lyra's heels, because this had apparently been arranged by Petra without consulting anyone, 2 small boys who had been carried out to the gate by a beleaguered nursemaid and set down approximately 30 seconds before Lyra arrived. Ronan sat on the courtyard stones and looked at her. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had first looked for her in the dark of a nursery, that had tracked her face with the fierce proprietary attention of someone cataloging something essential. He looked at her, and his face went through the transformation she knew from memory: alarm, recognition, relief, satisfaction. And then he got to his feet with the new, slightly unsteady confidence of someone who had learned to walk 3 months ago and was still treating it as a remarkable development. He walked to her. 3 steps, 4, 5. He covered the distance with a concentration that was entirely characteristic, then grabbed her leg with both hands and looked up at her with an expression of profound, complete, inarguable triumph. "There," he said. It was his first word. It was perfectly used. She lifted him. He grabbed her hair with both hands and pressed his face into her neck, and she stood in the spring courtyard of Vile Door Palace, with her mother on her left and a rogue warrior on her right, and a scholar behind her and a king who had changed his mind, and she held a small boy who had learned the word that mattered most to him and had been waiting to use it correctly. Cale was still sitting on the courtyard stones. He had watched all of this with the characteristic seriousness of someone taking comprehensive notes. Now he raised both arms. She crouched down. He climbed into her other arm with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been thinking about this for months. He put both hands on her face. She let him check. She let him be sure that she was there, that she was real, that whatever absence had been in his experience of the world was over. She stayed very still while he checked, and she breathed slowly, and she let the cold warmth move toward him the way it always had. His serious face went soft. "There," he said. Different word, same meaning. She stood up with both of them. She stood in the palace courtyard in the spring light, with Ronan's laugh starting up against her shoulder. Surprised by itself again, as always, as though joy ambushed him every single time. And Cale's face tucked into the side of her neck, and she felt the cold warmth in her chest doing what it had always done, being there, steady and constant, a fire that had survived everything it had been subjected to and was burning, if anything, more clearly than ever. Around her the courtyard had gone quiet. Not the quiet of a moment before confrontation, not the held breath quiet of a hierarchy deciding what to do about something unexpected. A different quiet. The quiet of a story finding its true shape, of something that has been wrong for a long time becoming, finally, right. She looked up. Calor stood at the palace entrance. He looked at his sons in her arms. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at the company that had arrived with the girl he had once called an insult to the throne, the girl who had signed an agreement that had ended a war, the girl who had stood at the convergence point and simply refused to be less than she was. He looked at Lyra, and Calor Veildor, Alpha King of 7 territories, a man who expressed himself in commands and silences, and the careful management of things too large for most people to hold, did something she had never seen him do in all the months of watching him from below stairs and beside cradles and across negotiating tables. He bowed. Not a political bow, not the formal, calculated deference of courts. A small, single, deliberate inclination. One man acknowledging one person in the simplest possible language that he had been wrong about what she was, and he understood now what she was, and he was not going to manage that fact into something more comfortable than it was. She received it. She held it alongside everything else she carried. The cold warmth, the memory of cold water, the sound of Ronan's first word in a palace courtyard, the feeling of her mother's arms in the convergence hollow. She held it, and she didn't diminish it or dismiss it or dress it in something more manageable. She simply said clearly, in the quiet courtyard, in the spring light, "Thank you." Then she walked up the palace steps, carrying both princes, and went inside. The girl who had scrubbed those floors had never been nothing. She had been something the world didn't have the vocabulary for yet, something it would need her to teach it, slowly, in council chambers, in convergence hollows and nurseries and negotiations, Over years that would be hard and bright and full of the specific difficulty of being the person who stands at the center and holds steady when everything around them wants to fall. She was the coal warmth. She was the veil walker. She was her grandmother's bloodline and her mother's courage and her own stubborn, unshakable refusal to accept a premise that was wrong. She was Lyra. That had always been enough. It was finally recognized.